Hey guys, tonight we're taking a candlelit stroll through some of the worst leadership decisions in medieval history. You know the type, kings who got the crown and immediately proved they couldn't even keep their own pants on, let alone hold a country together. If you've ever wondered what happens when the least qualified person in the kingdom inherits absolute power, well, you're about to find out. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you're emotionally invested in competency. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your city and local time in the comments. I like knowing where and when we're all pretending history is a warm bedtime story instead of a generational dumpster fire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're somewhere in Europe, and the year is... pick a random one between 500 and 1500, it barely matters. The feudal system is in full swing, castles are damp, hygiene is theoretical, and someone named Your Majesty is making deeply regrettable decisions that ripple out into famine, war, and occasionally flaming trebuchet failure. The Middle Ages were filled with moments of triumph and cultural growth, sure, but also a baffling number of royal faceplants. Not every king was a Richard the Lionheart or a Charlemagne. For every towering legend, there were 3 Henrys drooling on their own seals or ordering sieges that lasted longer than their reigns. Take a moment to imagine being born into this world. You, a noble child, are handed the crown not because you've earned it, but because some distant cousin was poisoned at a banquet. The barons bow, the court claps, and before you know it, you're being hoisted onto a horse you can't ride while half the kingdom schemes to either marry you or kill you. This is the backdrop for most of our doomed royal heroes. A cocktail of inherited power, poor judgment, and spectacular bad luck. But not all of them were just unlucky. Some, to put it politely, were not exactly bright. They lost entire provinces over temper tantrums, forgot how succession worked, or wandered into battles they had no plan of surviving. A few managed to combine personal instability with political mismanagement in ways that make modern politicians look like strategic geniuses. Mental illness, narcissism, insecurity, or just plain laziness. We'll see it all. The thing is, kingship in the Middle Ages wasn't a job you applied for. It was more like being born into a nightmare internship with no supervision, no HR department, and a tendency to end in exile, assassination, or some deeply embarrassing footnote in a chronicle. And while some kings simply faded into obscurity, others went down in flames so memorably that historians are still picking through the ashes, wondering how it all went so wrong. Let's set the tone with an image. Picture King John of England, brother of Richard the Lionheart, sitting red-faced in a tent, surrounded by angry barons and a piece of parchment he doesn't want to sign. It's 1215 and the Magna Carta is about to be born, not because John is a visionary of liberty and justice, but because he's been so consistently awful that his nobles have decided to legally limit his stupidity. John will feature in our next chapter, but he's a perfect example of the broader trend. Royal failure so epic it accidentally creates progress. And then there are kings like Charles the Fat. Yes, that was his real name, and yes, it was deserved. Imagine trying to hold together Charlemagne's empire, only instead of military genius and legal reforms, you bring indigestion and a talent for hiding from problems. Charles managed to lose pretty much everything his grandfather built, proving that dynastic greatness can be undone by one good nap and a bad diet. We'll travel across Europe tonight, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, even Byzantium. And everywhere we'll meet a familiar pattern. Young monarchs raised in gilded cages, flattered by courtiers, then released into the real world like a drunk chicken in a sword fight. Their failures aren't just funny in hindsight, they shaped nations. They provoked revolts, rewrote laws, redrew maps. Entire populations bore the brunt of one man's refusal to listen to advisors or read the room. Of course, not all of this is completely their fault. You'll notice some of our crown disasters started ruling as toddlers, or were manipulated by stronger forces around them. It raises a question historians still debate. Were these kings uniquely terrible, or just symbols of a broken system that kept handing swords to babies and calling it divine right? There's also a whole category of monarchs who weren't particularly dumb, but whose reigns were defined by absurd tragedy or grotesque irony. Take James II of Scotland, for instance. Great battlefield instincts, but we'll get to the part where he literally blows himself up. Or Louis II of Hungary, who drowns in full armour while fleeing a battle he technically started. You can't write this stuff, except we are slowly, and with the added benefit of hindsight and candle-scented sarcasm. You'll also notice how some of these royal stories feel eerily familiar. The nepotism, the ego, the refusal to relinquish power even when everything is visibly on fire. It's oddly comforting to realise that incompetence at the top isn't new, it's just got better costumes back then. Fur-lined robes, golden goblets, and enough relics to decorate 10 cathedrals, but still no clue how to run a country. And yes, some of these stories get dark. There's madness, betrayal, starvation, political assassination, and at least one documented king who believed he was made of glass. But we'll ease you through all of it, one sleepy royal disaster at a time. So grab your metaphorical sword, polish your non-existent crown, and brace yourself. Because once we start falling down this royal spiral staircase, there's no going back up. And next time you hear someone rant about modern government dysfunction, just remember, at least nobody's trying to launch a crusade while hallucinating they're the Pope's reincarnated uncle. We begin our tour of regal ruin with England's worst-rated monarch. And no, it's not Henry VIII, it's his ancestor John, the king so widely disliked he basically invented constitutional limits by being that awful. See you in the next chapter, where betrayal, barren rage and royal tantrums collide. You're standing in the muddy fields outside Runnymede, the air thick with mid-June humidity and the tense musk of horses, sweat and political resentment. In a damp tent nearby, a man named John, short, scowling and perpetually irritated, is gripping a quill like it just insulted him. Across from him sit a group of barons, equally displeased but much better dressed, holding out a document that will become one of the most important pieces of paper in Western history. This is the moment when King John of England, backed into a corner by his own incompetence, signs the Magna Carta. Not because he believes in democracy or justice or the balance of power, but because he's failed so spectacularly that even his inner circle has had enough. Let's rewind a bit. John, youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, wasn't supposed to be king. He was called John Lackland because, frankly, he wasn't getting much in the inheritance department. But fate has a sense of humour, and after the death of his elder brothers, including the much-glorified Richard the Lionheart, John stumbled his way into the English throne in 1199. Unfortunately for everyone, including himself, John lacked not just land but most traits desirable in a ruler. Strategy, diplomacy, charisma, humility, literacy to a degree, and basic self-control. Almost immediately he started losing things, mainly the Angevin Empire, which stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Within 5 years, John managed to lose nearly all his French territories to Philip X of France. These weren't minor border outposts, they were core holdings his ancestors had spent generations building up. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, gone. Some historians argue that Philip II was just a stronger opponent, but others point out that John had a special talent for alienating allies and executing the very people he should have been negotiating with. One notable case, Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew and potential rival, was captured and later mysteriously disappeared under John's care. Even in an era where mysterious royal deaths were practically a hobby, this one raised eyebrows. Back in England, things weren't much better. John squeezed every penny he could out of his barons through scutages, fees in lieu of military service, and randomly applied fines to nobles who didn't flatter him enough. If a nobleman died, John would seize their land and demand enormous fees from their heirs to get it back. It was like the worst HOA on earth, only with dungeons and crossbows. By 1215 the English barons were done playing nice. They raised armies, seized London, and forced John to meet them at Runnymede, where they laid out the Magna Carta, a document limiting royal authority and establishing the principle that even the king was subject to law. Of course, John didn't mean to actually follow it. He signed the Magna Carta under duress, then immediately wrote to the Pope and had the whole thing annulled. Cue the First Barons' War, where England descended into civil chaos. At one point the barons even invited the French Prince Louis to come over and take the throne. That's right. John had alienated his own nobles so thoroughly they tried to swap him out for a literal foreign invader. John died in 1216, likely from dysentery caught during the fighting. Fitting, really. His reign went out the same way it had functioned, messy, painful, and accompanied by panicked bowel movements. Here's the strange twist though. John's catastrophic reign led to something good. The Magna Carta didn't work at first, but it became a living symbol. It would be reissued, reinterpreted, and quoted centuries later as the basis for legal rights and constitutional law. So technically, John helped shape modern democracy. not by noble vision, but by being such a tyrannical disaster that people decided there had to be a better way. There's a fringe theory some historians love to bring up. Maybe John wasn't entirely terrible, just strategically unlucky. Maybe he inherited a collapsing empire and did the best he could with crumbling loyalties and an overstretched treasury. That's possible, but it's hard to overlook his paranoia, cruelty, and boneheaded diplomacy. Even contemporary chroniclers, not exactly known for roasting royalty, called him a tyrant and a thoroughly bad egg. You had to mess up pretty badly in the 1200s for scribes to throw shade like that. Still, he had a flair for unintentional comedy. There's a story about John fleeing his enemies across the Wash, a marshy inlet in eastern England, and miscalculating the tides. He lost his baggage train, along with them his crown jewels, to the rising waters. One minute he's a king crossing the mudflats, the next his royal bling is swallowed by the sea. To this day, treasure hunters still dream of finding that sunken loot. In fact, it's become one of England's enduring historical rumours, the lost crown of King John, waiting somewhere beneath the shifting sands. Another odd detail, despite being so universally disliked, John left behind a son, Henry III, who ruled for 56 years. That reign was long, tumultuous, and frankly deserving of its own future bedtime episode. But it means the Plantagenet line didn't just survive John's disaster. It flourished, as if the universe decided, okay, one mulligan. As night settles deeper around Runnymede in your mind, and the flickering torchlight casts long shadows on that infamous tent, Raoul can almost hear the frustrated scribbles of a man cornered by his own incompetence. John thought himself a ruler of divine right, chosen by God, untouchable by the law. What he got was the medieval equivalent of a legal cease and desist. So next time you hear the phrase checks and balances, remember that it all started with one of the worst kings in English history being forced to admit, on paper no less, that maybe he shouldn't have absolute power. Up next, a man named Charles who inherited everything, drooled all over it, fell asleep while it crumbled, and yes, his nickname is Charles the Fat. You are not ready. Imagine being born into one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, the grandson of Charlemagne himself, and still managing to go down in the books as Charles the Fat. Not Charles the Brave or Charles the Wise. No, you are forever remembered as the plus-sized footnote in the slow, awkward collapse of the Carolingian Empire. It's not entirely fair. His physical size wasn't the real problem. The problem was that he ruled like a man constantly waking up from a nap he never meant to take, surprised to find a crown still on his head. You first meet Charles in the 9th century, just as the grand legacy of his grandfather Charlemagne is wobbling like a top ready to fall. The empire is splitting under the weight of infighting, Viking raids and political fragmentation. And into this mess steps Charles, an emperor who somehow manages to unite the Carolingian Empire for a fleeting moment, only to immediately let it slip between his sausage-greased fingers. He started out as King of Alemannia, basically the southwestern corner of what's now Germany. By 881, he'd inherited Italy, parts of East Francia, and eventually became emperor. It should have been his redemption arc. The empire was back under one crown, and there was a real chance to restore Charlemagne's vision. Instead, Charles's reign becomes a masterclass in how to look busy while doing absolutely nothing of value. There were plagues, famine, and constant Viking incursions, and through it all, Charles remained steadfast in his commitment to delay every important decision until it was already too late. The crown jewel of his reign, by which we mean the largest wobbling cherry atop the disaster Sunday, was his handling of a major Viking siege in 886. Picture this. The Vikings sail down the Seine and lay siege to Paris. It's not a surprise attack, just everyone sees it coming. Paris, though not the polished capital we know today, is still a major hub. Local forces, led by the heroic Count Odo, defend the city tooth and nail for 11 months. And what does Charles the Fat do while his kingdom's vital artery is under attack? He watches, he waits, he ponders, and then, brace yourself, he pays the Vikings to go away. Now, medieval rulers did occasionally bribe invaders. It was a tactic, but Charles didn't just pay them to leave Paris. He offered them safe passage to plunder other parts of his own kingdom. That's not strategy, that's throwing your neighbour under the longship. The nobles were furious. His advisors were appalled. Odo, the guy who just held Paris together with half a garrison and a prayer, was understandably livid. This moment destroyed whatever credibility Charles had left. So why didn't he fight back? Why didn't he lead the charge like his grandfather would have? Well, that's part of the mystery. Some sources suggest he was suffering from a chronic illness, maybe epilepsy, maybe a mental disorder. Others imply he was just too cautious, too indecisive, or too disengaged to commit to anything that required bold action. Then there's the awkward fact that he frequently fell asleep during council meetings. Not metaphorically, literally nodded off mid-conversation. That's the kind of leadership that inspires revolts, and revolt they did. Within a year, the nobles of East Francia had enough. They deposed him in 887, choosing a non-Carolingian king for the first time in generations. Charles fled, humiliated, and died the next year, possibly from despair, illness, or simply being too exhausted to keep pretending he was in charge. Here's your quirky fact of the night. During the Paris siege, when food supplies got critically low, it's said that the defenders resorted to boiling leather for soup. That's how desperate things got while Charles snoozed in luxury elsewhere, possibly debating whether roast goose was too rich for lunch. Also, monks described his death as peaceful, which may be their passive-aggressive way of saying, at least he finally stopped ruining things. Scholars still argue over whether Charles deserves his reputation. Was he really that incompetent? Or was he just stuck managing an impossible empire in an era of decline? It's true he inherited a weakened realm already splitting along cultural and linguistic lines. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and he wasn't the only monarch bribing Vikings. But the consensus is still pretty firm. If leadership is about timing, decisiveness, and inspiration, Charles lacked all three. He was the emperor of inertia, the monarch of missed opportunities. And yes, he was heavy. That's part of how he earned his infamous nickname. But that's also a medieval chronicler's favourite insult, calling someone fat to suggest moral weakness or divine disfavour. Still, Charles leaned into it. He was known for grand, gluttonous feasts, elaborate religious processions, and self-aggrandizing rituals that baffled even the clergy. It's almost like he thought performance could replace actual leadership. By the time he died, the Carolingian Empire was in tatters. His own relatives carved up what remained, and soon the Empire Charlemagne, once ruled as a sprawling powerhouse, had collapsed into a patchwork of quarrelsome kingdoms. France and Germany, once united, were now distinctly on their own paths, and poor Charles the Fat had done nothing to stop it, except nap, feast, et dunduist, and delay the inevitable like a man waiting for someone else to do his job. There's something tragic about Charles. He wasn't evil, he wasn't cruel, he wasn't even especially ambitious. He was just tired. In a way, he might be the most relatable of all these failed monarchs, a man who inherited too much too late and didn't have the energy to pretend he knew what to do with it. So now we leave Charles in his velvet-lined bed, lulled into history's footnotes, while his empire crumbles outside. Coming up next, a 6-year-old king who had no idea what was happening, and honestly, neither did anyone else. Yes, it's time to meet Ludwig the Child, the medieval kingdom's worst daycare accident. Okay, imagine this. You're 6 years old. You still think mud pies are culinary achievements, you have no real concept of taxes, and your idea of diplomacy is letting your cousin borrow a toy sound sword. Now imagine someone hands you a crown, declares you King of East Francia, a major chunk of what we'd call Germany today, and expects you to run a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. Congratulations, you are now Ludwig the Child, the last legitimate Carolingian ruler of East Francia. This is going to go about as well as giving a toddler a siege engine. Ludwig comes into the world in 893, born to King Arnulf of Carinthia, who by medieval standards wasn't a complete disaster. Arnulf held things together with duct tape and battlefield rage, managing to keep the ever-growing Magyar threat at bay. But when he died in 899, everything changed. The crown passed to his only legitimate son, Ludwig, who at that point was still learning how to hold a spoon correctly. Of course, he wasn't really in charge. A regency council of nobles and bishops stepped in to rule in his name. And if you think that sounds like a recipe for backstabbing, power grabs, and a political gridlock, you're absolutely right. Here's the first problem. Child kings are rarely respected. Nobles immediately start manoeuvring for more autonomy, claiming that they're just helping out, while really carving out their own little fiefdoms. East Francia, already divided along tribal and linguistic lines, began to unravel. The Dukes of Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia started acting more like independent warlords than loyal vassals. Every royal decree passed through so many competing hands that it emerged as a limp suggestion, rather than a command. Meanwhile, the Magyars, those fearsome horseback raiders from the Hungarian plains, saw the confusion and thought, yes, this is exactly the level of dysfunction we're looking for. Throughout Ludwig's short reign, Magyar incursions increased, and these weren't polite medieval skirmishes. They were full-blown smash-and-grab attacks, lightning-fast raids that torched villages, looted monasteries, and scattered ill-prepared royal troops. East Francia needed strong, coordinated military resistance. What it got was a royal court arguing about inheritance rights, and who got to hold the king's reins during processions. Ludwig himself, from all accounts, was a quiet, sickly child. He's described in surviving documents mostly in passive terms. Things happened during his reign, but rarely because of him. He signed some documents as he got older, mostly to confirm what more powerful men had already decided. At best, he was a ceremonial figurehead. At worst, a human rubber stamp with a crown that didn't quite fit. And even as he grew into his teenage years, he never developed into a real power player. There's no record of major speeches, bold policies, or battlefield leadership. It's like watching a ghost drift through the pages of history, occasionally waving a scepter. One of the more tragic quirks about Ludwig's reign is that he was given titles he could never live up to. King of East Francia, sure, but also King of Lotharingia, and theoretically head of the Carolingian legacy in the East. That's a lot of expectation for someone who might still have been afraid of the dark. Chroniclers didn't even bother giving him dramatic stories. No major scandals, no battlefield follies, not even a juicy palace intrigue. He ruled like a background character in someone else's drama, except the whole empire was technically his responsibility. By the time Ludwig turned 17, things were looking dire. The dukes were openly acting like mini-kings. The Magyars had raided so deep they could probably draw you a map of the royal road system. The Carolingian name, once a badge of divine imperial might, was losing its luster fast. And in 911, Ludwig died. Still a teenager, still childlike, and still tragically unequipped for the throne he inherited. The cause of death? We don't really know. Some sources say illness. Others imply he just wasted away under the strain of expectation. There were whispers of inherited weakness. Maybe a degenerative condition, or something passed down through the inbred royal lines. Or maybe, as one slightly morbid modern historian put it, he simply expired from irrelevance. Oof. His death marked the end of the Carolingian male line in East Francia. With no heir and no viable Carolingian cousin to step in, the nobles got what they probably wanted all along, a reason to choose someone from their own ranks. They elected Conrad of Franconia as king, a non-Carolingian ruler who would set the stage for the rise of the Ottonian dynasty, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire. Ludwig the child's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was the symbolic end of an era. Here's a fun detail. Despite his total lack of battlefield achievements, Ludwig was sometimes depicted posthumously in royal garb, looking far more commanding than he ever was in real life. It's like medieval Photoshop, making someone seem more powerful in painting than they ever managed in policy. It wasn't just image rehabilitation, it was a way of preserving the myth of continuity, even as everything was falling apart. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Ludwig doomed from the start, or could a better Regency Council have turned things around? Was it the child king's fault, or the fault of greedy dukes who used his youth as an excuse to tear the kingdom apart? There's no clear answer, but most agree that Ludwig's reign was less about action and more about erosion. Slowly, methodically, authority slipped away, like sand through the fingers of a boy who never got the chance to rule with his own hands. So let's raise a soft, sympathetic sigh for Ludwig the child, the boy who became a king too soon and left the stage before he ever really entered it. Up next, though, is a man who ruled for decades, and whose reign is the reason a bunch of English nobles started carrying swords to family dinners. He's half king, half tragic sleepwalker. You're about to meet Henry VI of England, and trust me, things are about to get very foggy. Now we step into the soft grey mist of 15th century England, where the crown sits on the brow of a man who more than once forgets he's even wearing it. You're about to witness the reign of Henry VI, a king so bafflingly ineffective that his entire country spiralled into war. Not once, but over and over for decades. Imagine ruling England. inheriting a claim to the French throne and a legendary legacy, and then letting the whole house of cards collapse while you stare vacantly out the window, wondering what clouds are made of. Henry VI wasn't just a bad king, he was barely present at all. He came to the throne in 1422, an infant just 9 months old, after the death of his famous father Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, golden boy of English heroism, the king Shakespeare practically worshipped, so already the pressure was on. Henry VI, by contrast, wouldn't speak in full sentences until well into his reign. But it wasn't just because he was a baby, the pattern never really changed. His reign would be one long, slow-motion collapse, a kingdom waiting for a king to wake up. Like Ludwig the Child, Henry was initially managed by a regency council. But England in the 15th century wasn't dealing with Vikings. It was juggling civil unrest, a shaky occupation of France, and nobles who really wanted more power. And when Henry finally came of age in the late 1430s, it quickly became clear that he had the demeanour of a librarian and the backbone of a warm sponge. He hated violence, loathed confrontation, and preferred prayer over politics. Unfortunately, none of those qualities helped him keep hold of a crumbling empire. And crumble it did. England's grip on France had always been shaky, but under Henry it basically melted like cheese under a torch. The English lost territory after territory until they were driven out of all of France except Calais. Remember, Henry technically held the title King of France too, so every lost battle was not only a military defeat but a personal insult to his claim. Still, Henry barely responded. His court grew fractious, his nobles began turning on each other, and England's morale took a nosedive into the mud. By the 1450s, the country was fracturing. A major chunk of the population was fed up with royal inaction, high taxes, and general chaos. Enter the Plantagenet family drama, stage left. Specifically, the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the houses of Lancaster, Henry's line, and York, his rivals. You'd think Henry, being king, might step in to stop the bleeding. Instead, he did what he did best: quietly retreat. Here's where things get weird. In 1453, already a pivotal year with the fall of Constantinople, Henry suffered a total mental breakdown. He went completely catatonic for over a year, not sleeping, not eating much, not speaking, not even acknowledging the birth of his own son Edward. It was like someone unplugged the king. Historians still debate what happened. Was it a psychological break triggered by stress? A hereditary condition, possibly inherited from his maternal grandfather Charles VI of France, who believed he was made of glass? A stroke? No one knows for sure. During this time, his cousin Richard, Duke of York, essentially ran the government. And, surprise, he did a much better job. So naturally, conflict erupted when Henry finally regained enough awareness to notice someone else was being popular. Though notice might be too strong a word, Henry mostly allowed his ambitious wife, Margaret of Anjou, to handle matters. Margaret was feared, smart, politically savvy, and polarising. Her enemies called her manipulative. Her supporters called her the only reason the government still functioned at all. Now imagine this royal triangle: a barely functioning king, a queen desperate to protect her son's inheritance, and a rival duke who believed he could do it all better. It's a powder keg, and it explodes gloriously into decades of civil war. Battles like St Albans, Wakefield and Towton turn an England into a bloody chessboard. Henry is captured, released, captured again, and finally reinstalled as king when the Lancastrians briefly get the upper hand, but by this point, he's more a mascot than a monarch. The guy spends more time in hiding and captivity than on the throne. There's an oddly tragic dignity to Henry's decline. Despite all evidence, he never stopped believing he was the rightful ruler, chosen by God, meant to bring peace to his people. He just didn't know how, and in the end that wasn't enough. After Edward IV, son of the Duke of York, retook the throne, Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London. One cold night in 1471, with his wife exiled and his son dead, Henry was quietly murdered in his cell. Officially, he died of grief. Unofficially, it was more likely a dagger in the back courtesy of Edward's allies. Here's a curious fringe fact. Henry VI was later venerated by some as a saintly king. Pilgrims visited his supposed miracle sites. People claimed his tomb cured illnesses. Even after death, he had more influence in prayer than he ever had on a battlefield. Not quite the legacy his father dreamed of, but somehow fitting for a man who preferred rosary beads to war banners. And yes, the scholarly community still goes back and forth on whether Henry was truly mad, clinically depressed, or just a gentle soul in the wrong era. It's not so much that he failed as a person, he failed as a medieval king, a role that required blood, steel and charisma. He ruled in an age that demanded lions. Henry brought a lamb. So now we leave the tower where the candles burned low and the last flicker of Lancaster ambition dies with a whisper. Our next monarch? A man who didn't just bungle kingship, he paid literal tribute to his enemies, then acted surprised when they raided him again. It's time to meet Ethelred the Unready, a man so perpetually unprepared that history decided to slap it right into his nickname. Let's go back a bit further now, turn the century dial way back to the late 900s. The Viking Age is still very much alive and kicking, and England, bless it, is trying to pretend it's holding things together. Enter Ethelred II, better known as Ethelred the Unready, a nickname so devastating it's survived for over 1,000 years. But here's the twist. Unready didn't originally mean clueless or unprepared. It came from the Old English word unrad, which actually meant bad counsel, or no counsel. But let's be honest, unready ended up being pretty accurate too, because if there was a right thing to do, you could count on Ethelred to do the opposite, or at least to do it too late, too poorly, and with deeply unintended consequences. You first meet Ethelred in 978, when he ascends to the throne under, let's call them suspicious circumstances. His half-brother, King Edward the Martyr, had been murdered, stabbed while riding up to see Ethelred's mother. The murder was never officially pinned on young Ethelred or his mum, but the optics were not great. Edward had been king for 3 years, suddenly he's bleeding out in a stable courtyard, and within days Ethelred is crowned. If there was ever a royal PR team in Anglo-Saxon England, they definitely earned hazard pay. At the time, England was a patchwork kingdom trying to hold off a rising storm. Viking raiders were still plundering monasteries and coastal towns with unnerving ease, and the kingdom needed a strong, decisive king. Instead, they got a teenager who spent most of his early reign listening to a court of squabbling nobles and scheming advisors. Ethelred wasn't stupid, but he was passive, reactive, and deeply susceptible to bad advice, hence the original meaning of unrad. One of the worst decisions? His handling of the Danegeld. Rather than fight off Viking raids with military force, Ethelred paid them off. Literally. He handed over huge sums of silver and gold to make them go away. It worked, for about 5 minutes. The Vikings would take the money, sail off, and return the next year, now richer and more confident. It was like paying a school bully to stop hitting you, only to find out you've just funded his protein shakes and brass knuckles. Between 991 and 1016, England paid multiple rounds of Danegeld, sometimes in amounts equivalent to the entire GDP of the kingdom. One particularly juicy payment in 1012 involved £48,000 of silver. That's not a bribe, that's a down payment on long-term failure. But Ethelred's worst move might have been the St. Brice's Day massacre in Yarhenno II. Frustrated by the constant Viking incursions, he decided to strike back, not at the raiders themselves, but at the Danish population living peacefully within England's borders. On November 13th, Ethelred ordered the execution of all the Danes living in the kingdom, fearing they were a potential fifth column. Spoiler, it backfired horribly. Not only did it alienate peaceful communities, but it also enraged King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, whose sister, possibly, was among the victims. Sweyn responded by launching a full-scale invasion, conquering parts of England with terrifying speed and then eventually forcing Ethelred to flee to Normandy. Yes, he ran away, an actual English king exiled from his own country, hiding with the Normans while Sweyn sat on the English throne. Ethelred only returned after Sweyn died suddenly, in 1014, and the nobles, desperate, divided, and probably out of better options, invited him back under the condition that he would govern more justly than he had before. That's the kind of negotiation you reserve for a disappointing manager who's already been fired once. He limped through another 2 years of turmoil before dying in 1016, just as Sweyn's son, Canute the Great, was on his way to claim the crown. Ethelred's reign ended not with peace or prosperity, but with a complete loss of control. His line would survive through his son Edward the Confessor, but his name, that stayed firmly in the do not repeat category. Here's a quirky detail. Ethelred was responsible for commissioning a massive building project, Westminster Abbey's earlier incarnation, and a bunch of coinage reforms, so he wasn't totally asleep at the wheel. But even these projects were dwarfed by the sheer scale of his failures. Every time he tried to assert authority, it unravelled. Every time he tried diplomacy, it turned into tribute. It's like watching someone try to plug a leaking dam with bread. Scholars have tried valiantly to rehabilitate Ethelred. They argue that he inherited a deeply unstable kingdom, that Viking warfare was evolving in terrifying ways, and that no king could have held the line. Maybe. But there's no denying that his leadership was chaotic, reactive, and uncoordinated. Instead of building coalitions, he undermined his own nobles. Instead of reforming the military, he outsourced his problems. Instead of earning loyalty, he inspired betrayal and rebellion. And his name, Ethelred the Unready, became shorthand for royal cluelessness in the centuries that followed. Some even say he paved the way for the Norman conquest. His reign weakened English unity, disrupted succession, and let foreign powers get their boots in the door. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066, he wasn't just claiming a throne, he was seizing a kingdom that had been worn thin by men like Ethelred, who treated the crown like a prize rather than a responsibility. So now, picture Ethelred in his final years, aging, tired, sick of chasing the same chaos he helped create. He dies just as the Vikings are storming the gates again, leaving a kingdom fractured and embarrassed. Even in death, he couldn't really hold the throne. Canute would step in soon after and rule better than Ethelred ever could. Coming up next, a royal tragedy you've probably never heard of. He wasn't a king, but he sure thought he was meant to be, and his story ends in madness, isolation, and a locked tower. Let's meet Don Carlos of Spain, the heir to one of Europe's greatest empires, and one of its most alarming sons. So now we sail from the foggy, wind-lashed shores of Anglo-Saxon England to the sun-baked paranoia of 16th century Spain, where the shadows are longer, the politics sharper, and the stakes, well, you're about to meet someone who made losing your mind a full-time court position. His name is Don Carlos, the only son of Philip II of Spain. He was never crowned king, but that didn't stop him from acting like the world owed him a throne, several armies, and probably the moon. His life is a harrowing, darkly fascinating spiral into obsession, violence, and royal imprisonment. If Henry VI was too gentle for his era, Don Carlos was too unhinged for any era at all. Let's set the stage. It's the height of the Spanish Empire. We're talking the 1500s, when Spain is flush with New World gold, naval dominance, and enough Inquisition-themed dread to make every candlelit hallway feel like a trap. King Philip II is the ruler of a vast and expanding empire spanning continents. He's serious, intensely Catholic, and always dressed in enough black to make him look like a moody funeral director with world-conquering ambitions. His one job now, aside from oppressing the Low Countries and ticking off Elizabeth I, is to raise a capable heir. That would be Don Carlos. Don Carlos is born in 1545 to Philip's first wife, Maria of Portugal. Tragically, she dies in childbirth, which leaves Carlos motherless from day one and completely surrounded by power-hungry, grief-soaked courtiers. The Habsburg family he's born into is already infamous for one particular trait: inbreeding. They like to marry cousins, uncles, nieces, anyone with the right title, really. And Carlos? He got the full gene soup. He was the product of generations of dynastic recycling, and it showed. Physically, he was frail, with one leg shorter than the other. His head was misshapen, his spine didn't sit quite right, but it was his mind that worried everyone. Even as a child, Don Carlos showed signs of instability. He was erratic, cruel, and prone to violent outbursts. There's a story about him boiling a servant's pet in oil for a prank. Another tells of him kicking a pregnant woman down the stairs because she didn't bow quickly enough. And while court historians might have exaggerated these tales to match the drama of his downfall, they weren't entirely off base. Carlos had no impulse control, no grasp of nuance, and no tolerance for being told no. Philip II, who treated emotions like a trapdoor to hell, tried to manage his son with cold distance and calculated pressure. As Carlos got older, he was kept increasingly isolated but granted ceremonial titles. He demanded real power, of course, like governing the Netherlands, but Philip wisely said no. That rejection sparked a psychological unravelling worthy of Shakespeare. Carlos began to imagine himself as a rival to his own father. He talked openly about overthrowing the king, allying with the Dutch rebels, even assassinating members of the court. One plot allegedly involved setting fire to the entire palace during a royal ceremony. By 1568, something snapped. Whether it was schizophrenia, psychosis, or the final toll of generations of cousin marriage, Don Carlos became completely unstable. He stopped bathing, he refused food, he began wandering the palace halls at night with weapons, muttering to himself and threatening staff. At one point he tried to flee to the Low Countries, an act that would have ignited a full-scale rebellion. This was the final straw. Philip had his son arrested. Now, let's pause and appreciate the gravity of that. Monarchs executed nobles all the time. They drowned political rivals, tortured rebels, but locking up your own heir, your only legitimate son, was a move so bold it echoed across Europe. Carlos was confined to a heavily guarded wing of the palace. No visitors, no letters, no sunlight. Just endless silence and the occasional physician, probably bribed to look away when things got too grim. He would remain there for 6 months. No trial, no formal charges, just absolute isolation. The court issued vague announcements about health and spiritual reflection, but everyone knew Carlos had become a problem the crown couldn't afford to unleash. In July 1568, he died in his cell, officially from natural causes. Unofficially, people whispered about starvation, poison, or something far worse behind the locked doors. Philip, ever the cold administrator, had his son buried with full honours, but no one was fooled. Now here's your quirky twist. Don Carlos became a romantic hero. Yes, that Don Carlos, the possible arsonist, the would-be regicide, the guy who probably murdered a dog with a fork, was rebranded by 19th century romantics as a misunderstood soul. Friedrich Schiller wrote a play about him. Giuseppe Verdi turned it into an opera. In their telling, Carlos was a noble, freedom-loving dreamer, crushed by the iron boot of absolutism. Never mind the madness, never mind the cruelty. Suddenly he was the tragic star of an anti-tyranny epic. Historians have spent years undoing that glow-up. The scholarly debate centres around how mentally ill Carlos really was. Was he born that way? Was he broken by pressure, grief, or confinement? Or was he, as some harsher critics argue, simply a cruel, dangerous man who should have never been near a throne? We'll never know for sure, but one thing is clear. He was not fit to rule. Not by temperament, not by intellect, not even by genetic luck. And it's terrifying to consider. If Philip had died unexpectedly, Don Carlos would have inherited the most powerful empire in Europe. The world could have seen a king who believed torture was sport and war a hobby. That we didn't is less thanks to wisdom and more a grim stroke of survival instinct on Philip's part. Say what you will about cold-hearted absolutism, it might have saved Europe from a dynasty-ending catastrophe. So let's close the palace doors on Don Carlos, who died locked inside a room he might well have burned down himself if given the chance. We're heading back to France now, to meet another man who inherited everything, accomplished nothing, and was nicknamed as if his legacy were an unpaid nap. Louis the Sluggard is next, and believe me, he lives down to the name. Let's now the shift to 10th century France, where the royal court is sagging under the weight of indifference, regional power struggles, and one man's spectacular talent for not doing anything. His name? Louis XV, the final Carolingian king of West Francia, though almost no one remembers him by that title. History chose to call him Louis the Sluggard, which even in a world where nicknames like Charles the Bald and John Soft Sword were floating around, is deeply unflattering. The Sluggard doesn't exactly scream military glory or administrative brilliance. It screams sleeping in until the realm catches fire and then blaming the butler. Louis V ruled for exactly one forgettable, barely functional year, from 986 to 987. But to understand his failure, you've got to peek a little behind the curtain. The Carolingians, the dynasty of Charlemagne, Charles the Fair, and all those barely hanging on nobles, had been losing their grip on power for decades. The great empire had fractured, and what remained in West Francia, which would later become France, was mostly symbolic. Real power lay in the hands of powerful dukes, counts, and churchmen. The king at this point was mostly a figurehead with a crown and a prayer, usually written by someone else. Louis was born in 967 to King Lothair of France, who, while no model ruler, at least attempted to govern with some basic effort. Lothair tried to push back against German influence and reassert control over the nobles, with mixed results. When Louis came of age, Lothair tried to solidify his son's legitimacy by crowning him as co-king in 979, basically a training wheels monarchy. Even this cautious step didn't inspire much faith. Louis was reportedly unmotivated, uninterested in political affairs, and more interested in hunting and relaxing than in administration or foreign policy. It was like giving the keys to the kingdom to a guy who thinks ruling means occasionally attending a feast and signing whatever parchment someone slides across the table. One of Louis's most famous flops? His ill-fated marriage. His father arranged for him to marry Adelaide of Anjou, a politically significant match designed to shore up royal support in southern France. Adelaide was smart, experienced, and roughly twice Louis's age. She had already been widowed twice and had managed her own lands. In other words, she was not going to be steamrolled by a lazy teenage prince. Surprise, it didn't work out. The marriage fell apart almost immediately. Adelaide accused Louis of being immature and erratic, while Louis accused her of plotting against him. He tried to have the marriage annulled. She refused to go quietly and fled court, essentially daring him to come get her. He didn't. That level of inaction sets the tone for his entire reign. When Louis finally became king in 986, the kingdom was already slipping through the monarchy's fingers. The nobles didn't need to rebel because they were already doing whatever they wanted. The church was more politically coordinated than the royal court, and Louis did almost nothing. He didn't rally troops, he didn't issue reforms, he didn't even make a memorable speech or launch a flashy pilgrimage. He basically ruled like someone who'd forgotten he had homework due. Then in 987, the curtain falls early. Louis died, suddenly at the age of just 20. The cause? Most sources say a hunting accident, which feels almost poetic given how much time he spent chasing deer instead of dukes. Some accounts suggest he fell off his horse, others say he hit his head. Either way, his death was so abrupt and uneventful that many of his own subjects barely noticed, and the crown shockingly did not pass to another Carolingian. Instead, the nobles elected Hugh Capet, a powerful duke with real land, real influence, and zero connection to the old Carolingian bloodline. This marked the end of the Carolingians in France and the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, which would eventually evolve into the line of kings that led France through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and straight into the guillotine centuries later. So yes, Louis's failure wasn't just personal, it closed the curtain on an entire royal age. Here's your quirky detail. Despite his nickname and historical reputation, there are no surviving contemporary documents that describe Louis V as the Sluggard. That moniker came later, likely from Capetian historians looking to justify their new dynasty. It's possible Louis wasn't quite as lazy as legend claims, but when your entire reign fits in a paragraph and your only accomplishment was failing to annul your own marriage, the nickname kind of sticks. And the scholarly debate? It lingers around whether Louis's reign was doomed by his own shortcomings, or whether the monarchy itself had already become obsolete. Was he truly worse than his predecessors, or was he just the last unlucky guy left holding the ceremonial sword while the real players moved on? Historians tend to agree on one thing. Even if Louis had been competent, he would have faced an uphill battle against a fractured kingdom and a nobility that saw the crown as more of a fashion accessory than an actual authority. In the end, Louis the Sluggard becomes the answer to a trivia question. Who was the last Carolingian king of France? But in the bedtime story of royal misfires, he earns his place not for what he did, but for what he never got around to doing. Leadership requires effort, attention, and willpower. Louis brought none of those. He was the king who couldn't be bothered. So now we leave him where he always seemed most comfortable, off in the woods somewhere, half listening to his advisors, daydreaming while history quietly passed him by. Next up, though, we're turning up the heat and the murder, because Peter of Castile, our next monarch, might have been called the Just by some, but most people remember him as Peter the Cruel. Get ready. This one swings from reform to torture and back again before bedtime. Let's step into the blazing heart of 14th century Castile, where kings didn't just rule, they schemed, slaughtered, and occasionally flipped the moral compass like a coin. Heads, justice. Tails, absolute chaos. Standing right in the middle of that moral roulette wheel is Peter of Castile, a man whose legacy is still arm wrestling itself centuries later. Some called him Peter the Just, a defender of the law and an early champion of administrative reform. Others, probably the ones with the burn scars and missing relatives, called him Peter the Cruel, And if you're hoping to figure out which one he really was, well, don't hold your breath. You'd be safer assuming he was both, depending on the time of day and how many assassination notes were stacked on his desk. Peter was born in 1334 to Alfonso XI and Maria of Portugal, which already makes him a blend of Iberian political anxieties. His childhood was a buffet of tension, royal mistresses, half-siblings with swords, and a mother who spent much of her life being sidelined by the court. Alfonso XI played favourites, namely favouring his mistress Leonor de Guzman, with whom he had 10 children. Peter, though legitimate, grew up surrounded by ambitious bastards and a mother itching for revenge, not exactly the recipe for emotional stability. When Peter became king in 1350 at the age of 16, Castile was already in a bad mood. The Black Death was hovering like a cloud of doom. The nobility was fragmented. Famine and plague were thinning the population. Into this mess stepped a teenager who was insecure, sharp-tongued and deeply paranoid. His early reign saw a burst of energy. He reasserted royal authority, punished corrupt nobles, and tried to streamline the courts. He taxed more equitably and pushed back on aristocratic abuses. The poor liked him, merchants liked him, anyone who wasn't born with a title liked him, for a while. But Peter had 2 major problems. He couldn't stop alienating the very people who kept him in power, and he really liked killing people who annoyed him. Sometimes it was political, sometimes it was personal, sometimes it was both. He executed nobles for disloyalty, fair. Then he started killing their relatives just to be safe, less fair. His executions were often public, brutal, and delivered with no apology. One noblewoman was accused of harbouring a rival. Peter allegedly had her roasted alive. Another story claims he stabbed a man during dinner, then calmly returned to his meal. He was like a walking medieval Yelp review, except if you got 1 star you died. His relationship life? An opera of contradictions. He married Blanche of Bourbon but abandoned her almost immediately for his mistress, Maria de Padilla. Blanche was imprisoned and eventually died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned, though Peter denied involvement. Maria, meanwhile, became the closest thing Peter ever had to an emotional anchor. He insisted they'd married in secret, and after her death, he declared her his one true queen. It's one of the only times Peter seems even remotely sentimental. Everything else was political ice and hot revenge. And speaking of revenge, Peter's half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, wasn't exactly cheering him on. Born to Leonor de Guzman, Henry saw Peter as a spoiled tyrant who'd usurped a throne he didn't deserve. To be fair, Peter had executed several of Henry's full brothers by this point, so there was personal motivation. In 36, Henry launched a full-blown rebellion with help from France and Aragon. Peter, ever confident, fought back with his own allies, including, oddly enough, Edward the Black Prince from England. For one shining moment, Peter was the underdog comeback story, reclaiming his throne after being briefly ousted. But it wouldn't last. His alliances crumbled, his charisma had long since expired. The people who once called him the Just started muttering the cruel under their breath. In 1369, during a particularly desperate stage of the war, Peter met Henry for a parley. This meeting, held in a tent outside Montiel, was supposed to be a negotiation, or at least a dramatic gesture of fraternal diplomacy. Instead, it turned into one of the most infamous sibling confrontations in royal history. According to legend, the 2 half-brothers were brought into the tent by go-betweens. Peter lunged first. Henry, aided by one of his knights, stabbed Peter repeatedly until the King of Castile lay dead in a pool of royal blood. It was personal. It was brutal. It was the end of Peter's reign, and the birth of the Trastamara dynasty, which would rule Castile for generations. Now, here's the fringe fact. There are still people in Spain today who argue that Peter got a raw deal. Some chroniclers, especially later ones, claimed he was demonized by enemies who benefited from rewriting his legacy. They point out that Peter protected Jews and Muslims during a time of escalating intolerance, that he pursued merit-based reforms, and that many of his so-called cruelties were exaggerated. Was he a proto-enlightened monarch in a brutal age, or a man who used justice as an excuse for bloodlust? The debate rages on. The scholarly consensus is cautious. Peter was not insane, but he was unrelentingly harsh. He centralized power like a modern bureaucrat, but enforced it like a Roman executioner. His reign was one long balancing act on the edge of a knife, until he slipped, and the blade caught him in the ribs. So let's leave Peter now, somewhere between justice and cruelty, left buried under the weight of his own contradictions. In his kingdom, roads ran smoother, taxes hit more fairly, and the law was briefly supreme, but you had to survive the purge to enjoy it. Next, we're heading north to Bohemia to meet a man who took laziness, indulgence, and beer-chugging incompetence to such heights that even his own nobles locked him up. Get ready for Wenceslaus IV. Definitely not the one from the Christmas Carol. You know that catchy old Christmas tune about good King Wenceslaus looking out in the feast of Stephen? Sweet guy. Beloved, pious, charitable. Well, tonight we're talking about a very different Wenceslaus, Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, who makes the Carol King look like a saint from another planet. This Wenceslaus didn't bring snowshoe bread to the poor, or stroll through blizzards with a heart full of cheer. No, this guy is the medieval equivalent of a boss who locks his office door, drinks on the job, and then gets offended when the building catches fire. And yes, his own nobles literally imprisoned him more than once, just to keep him from ruining everything faster. Wenceslaus IV ruled in the late 14th century, starting in 1378 after the death of his father, the highly competent and generally respected Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia. Now, Charles left some impossibly big royal shoes to fill. The guy practically carried the Holy Roman Empire on his back, built up Prague like it was going to host Eurovision, and somehow kept all his squabbling German vassals in check. His son? Not so much. Where Charles had patience and vision, Wenceslaus had mood swings and a drinking problem. Let's begin with the setup. When Wenceslaus inherited the throne, he got a 2-for-1 deal. King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, which meant he was Emperor-elect of the Holy Roman Empire, waiting for coronation. You'd think someone in that position would take the whole ruling Christendom thing seriously. But Wenceslaus never seemed all that interested. He liked art, hunting, and long evenings with large quantities of beer. Governance, on the other hand, bored him to tears. He skipped imperial diets, those important meetings where rulers decided the fate of Europe, ignored crises, and let factional violence fester unchecked. Now, to be fair, Bohemia at this time was no walk in the royal park. Tensions were rising between Catholics and reformist preachers. There were rising demands for political autonomy among local nobles. Corruption in the church was everywhere, but instead of mediating, Wenceslaus did what any self-respecting half-motivated monarch might do. He picked favourites, fired loyal ministers on a whim, and occasionally had people assassinated when the mood struck him. In one case, he had a high-ranking official thrown out of a window during a drunken rage, setting a precedent for Prague's future defenestrations that would become a weirdly recurring Czech tradition. As his reign went on, Wenceslaus became more and more erratic. He'd alternate between bursts of angry authority and long stretches of doing absolutely nothing. In times of national crisis, he would retreat into his palace, drink heavily, and shut everyone out. If Twitter existed in 1380, where? His Wenceslaus would have been trending every time a city caught fire or a bishop went rogue. By 1400, the German princes had had enough. They deposed him as King of the Romans, accusing him of negligence, weakness, and, you guessed it, drunken incompetence. They installed a new king, Rupert of the Palatinate, while Wenceslaus sulked in Prague and refused to acknowledge what had happened. Technically, he still held the title of King of Bohemia, and he clung to it with the enthusiasm of someone hugging a barrel of mead for emotional support. Here's where things take a darker turn. The tension between reformers and the church was boiling over, and Wenceslaus was caught in the middle. He'd occasionally support Jan Hus, a Czech reformer who criticised the church's corruption and would later be burned at the stake. But Wenceslaus never fully committed to Hus or his cause. He was too indecisive, too easily swayed by whichever group shouted the loudest that day. As a result, he alienated everyone: Catholics, reformers, nobles, and commoners alike. At one point in 1394, a group of Bohemian nobles actually kidnapped the king. Let that sink in. They didn't just depose him or exile him, they captured him, locked him in a castle, because they believed that his continued presence in government was an active threat to national stability. He was later released, thanks to his loyal half-brother Sigismund, but even then he didn't clean up his act. He returned to power and immediately resumed his pattern of ineffective rulings, missed councils, and occasional bursts of random violence. And here's your weird fact. Despite all of this, Wenceslaus had a genuine love of books. He commissioned illuminated manuscripts, supported scribes and artists, and created one of the most beautifully illustrated Bibles of the Middle Ages, the Wenceslaus Bible, still famous today. He was like a chaotic art collector who sometimes remembered he was a king between naps. His support of culture was real, even admirable, if only he'd ruled as effectively as he read. So what do scholars say? Some argue that Wenceslaus wasn't as bad as his enemies claimed. After all, many of the negative accounts come from German nobles who had obvious political reasons to smear him. Others say he was a man with genuine mental health struggles, possibly depression, maybe even bipolar disorder, made worse by alcohol and stress. Still, it's hard to ignore the fact that he did repeatedly ignore political fires until they burned out of control. Leadership in the Middle Ages required more than charisma. It demanded consistency. And Wenceslaus had all the consistency of a loose chandelier in an earthquake. He died in 1419 at the age of 58, just as his kingdom was about to erupt into the Hussite Wars, a massive religious and civil conflict partly fueled by his failure to take a side. His successor, yep, that same half-brother Sigismund, would inherit a Bohemia ready to explode. Wenceslaus, meanwhile, slipped out of history with a legacy of half-built reforms, beautiful books, and nobles with very real trauma from being ruled by a part-time monarch. So now, let's bid farewell to the man who ruled like a ghost haunting his own throne. Distant, moody, and occasionally terrifying if you caught him in a rage spiral. Coming up next is another royal who didn't quite hold the steering wheel of his own reign. John Balliol, Scotland's king-shaped pawn who ended up more useful as a political excuse than an actual ruler. Now we head north to the damp, windswept land of thistles, bagpipes, and historic grudges. Medieval Scotland, where the throne was less of a seat of power and more like the hot potato from a centuries-long game nobody wanted to lose. And in the late 13th century, nobody lost it quite like John Balliol, the unfortunate soul who briefly became king, got steamrolled by Edward I of England, and then spent the rest of his life as the guy you mention when you want to remind people how not to run a kingdom. Seriously, John Balliol was less a ruler and more a medieval cautionary tale. How to get a crown, immediately fumble it, and end up in comfortable but humiliating exile. To be fair, John didn't exactly leap onto the throne. He was dragged up there. In 1290, Scotland was left without a clear heir after the death of the young Queen Margaret, the so-called Maid of Norway. She was a sweet child who was supposed to marry into the English royal line and unify the kingdoms peacefully. Instead, she died en route to Scotland, and suddenly the country had a royal vacuum. Cue The Great Cause, a lengthy royal reality show in which over a dozen noble families could put forward claims to the Scottish throne. The two frontrunners, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the more famous future king Robert the Bruce, each had decent claims, a pile of paperwork, and a horde of backers willing to throw knives for them. Enter Edward III of England, also known as Edward Longshanks, also known as the guy you do not want brokering your internal affairs. Edward offered to mediate the succession crisis, with the small, easily missed caveat that whoever won had to accept him as overlord. John Balliol, perhaps thinking this was just a polite formality, agreed. He was crowned King of Scots in 1292, and almost immediately Edward began treating him like a regional manager, not a sovereign monarch. He summoned Balliol to English courts, overturned Scottish rulings, and generally reminded everyone that Scotland wasn't really allowed to do anything without English permission. Balliol, stuck between trying to preserve what little authority he had and not completely surrendering to Edward, flailed. His nobles grew restless. His people, proud and fiercely independent, seethed. Things came to a head in 1295 when Balliol, finally fed up, formed an alliance with France. This move, known as the beginning of the Old Alliance, was bold and predictably disastrous. Edward took this as an act of war and launched a brutal campaign to crush Scottish resistance. And so began the First War of Scottish Independence, but with a whimper, not a bang. Edward marched north with a massive army, easily taking key castles and defeating Balliol's poorly organised forces. After a humiliating loss at the Battle of Dunbar in 1296, Balliol fled, only to be cornered and forced to abdicate in front of Edward himself. And here's the part that really seals his reputation in the historical losers' club. Edward had Balliol stripped of his royal insignia in a formal ceremony. His crown, sceptre and robes were publicly removed, and the moment was so theatrical it earned a nickname, Tum Tabard, which means empty coat. That's what they called him after. John Empty Coat Balliol. The king who ruled in name only, stripped down like a disgraced prom king after the crown's repossessed. Edward, now in control, began occupying Scotland directly, something that would backfire spectacularly a few years later when William Wallace and Robert the Bruce kicked off their legendary resistance. But Balliol, he wasn't part of that. After abdicating, he was sent to the Tower of London, then released under supervision, and eventually allowed to retire to his family lands in France. He lived out his days in quiet obscurity, probably tending vineyards and pretending the whole king thing had never happened. Here's your quirky fact: despite all the chaos, Balliol's family somehow ended up founding a college at Oxford University, Balliol College, still around today. So while he flopped as a king, his legacy managed to get a small second wind as an academic institution, training some of the world's sharpest minds for centuries to come. He may not have governed Scotland successfully, but somewhere, somehow, a Balliol was probably grading a paper on Scottish political failure. The irony writes itself. Now, some scholars argue that Balliol was simply overwhelmed. He wasn't a tyrant or a fool, just a cautious, average man thrown into a mess far beyond his abilities. The system around him collapsed, and Edward I was one of the most aggressive, capable monarchs of the age. Could anyone have succeeded in Balliol's place? Probably not easily, but his constant vacillation, his lack of decisive action, and his failure to rally either nobles or commoners to his side certainly didn't help. In a way, he governed like a man trying to keep his shoes dry during a flood, hesitating at every step until the tide swept him off entirely. In Scottish memory, Balliol's name is mostly used to signal weakness. He's the king who bowed too easily, the symbol of a Scotland under someone else's thumb. But what's maybe more interesting is that, after all of this, his own son Edward Balliol would later return to Scotland and try to reclaim the throne with English support. Spoiler, that didn't go well either. The Balliols were not a dynasty that learned from their mistakes. So now we leave John Balliol not in a blaze of glory but in a faded villa in France, sipping wine and listening to second-hand news of a rebellion he had no part in. He was the king who was crowned by one enemy and dethroned by another, a man who ruled for a moment and was then erased like chalk on a wet slate. Coming up next, another royal, with big titles and a tragically short fuse, Valdemar the Young of Denmark, the teenage co-king whose reign ended with one unlucky crossbow bolt at the world's worst hunting party. Tonight, we pause our march through royal wreckage to examine a ruler who didn't exactly fail at governance. He just didn't live long enough to even try. Meet Valdemar the Young of Denmark, a teenage co-king who was being prepped for greatness but instead became a cautionary tale about what happens when you mix the royal processions, loaded crossbows, and the terrifying unpredictability of feudal Denmark. His story is short, dramatic, and more than a little tragic. A medieval version of He Had So Much Potential, cut short by a freak accident that changed the course of Danish history. Let's rewind to the early 1200s, when Denmark was actually having a bit of a moment. Under King Valdemar II, also known as Valdemar the Victorious, Denmark had become a rising northern powerhouse. The king was charismatic, ambitious, and successful in expanding Danish influence into what we'd now call northern Germany and the Baltic states. As kings go, he was doing pretty well, but Valdemar II had a problem. He needed to secure succession and maintain dynastic stability in a part of Europe where your nobles could flip sides faster than a bad Tinder date. So, like many kings, he didn't wait for death to pass the crown. Instead, he appointed his son Valdemar the Young as co-king in 1218. It was a common medieval strategy to get people used to the heir before the old man croaked. And on paper, Valdemar the Young was a solid pick, bright, energetic, and well-liked among the Danish court. He was also married to Eleanor of Portugal, a royal alliance move that made Denmark look very cosmopolitan. A golden-haired prince with charm and a Portuguese princess by his side. It almost sounds like a Disney setup. Then things started to unravel. In 1223, during a hunting trip, both Valdemar and his son were kidnapped by Count Henry of Schwerin, one of those German nobles with a long memory and a short fuse. The Danes had seized his land years earlier, and he decided to get even the old-fashioned way, with armed men and shackles. The king and his son were dragged off and held for ransom in Germany for nearly 3 years. During their imprisonment, Denmark descended into mild chaos. Nobles began bickering, regions drifted toward autonomy, and foreign enemies started sniffing around the borders. Eventually the ransom was paid, an eye-watering sum that drained Denmark's coffers and forced major territorial concessions. When father and son finally returned, they were not the triumphant victors of Northern Europe anymore. Valdemar the Second had lost face, his son had lost time, and the nobility had gotten a taste of what it was like to be mostly in charge. Still, the court tried to restore some sense of normalcy. In 1231, they staged a grand royal procession and hunting expedition near Refsnes, meant to show that things were back on track, the monarchy was strong, and the young co-king was ready to lead. It was a victory lap, a royal bonding weekend, a fancy photo shoot in the forest. Then came the crossbow. Accounts are fuzzy, but here's the gist. While out hunting, Valdemar the Young was shot by a crossbow bolt and it killed him. Whether it was a stray shot, a horrible accident, or something more sinister is still up for debate. Some say it was a member of his own hunting party. Others whisper darker theories, that it was political sabotage disguised as misfire. After all, there were nobles who weren't thrilled about the young prince reclaiming full authority after their years of relative freedom. But whatever the truth, the result was the same. Valdemar the Young died at age 22, struck down in what should have been a celebration of his future reign. His death left Denmark in shock. The people had been told he was the future. He had the right name, the royal backing, and the charm to carry on the Valdemar dynasty. And now he was a corpse in a gilded coffin, barely into adulthood. His young wife, Eleanor of Portugal, died not long after, heartbroken, some said, or just another casualty of the era's brutal childbirth rates and contagious disease. The golden couple was gone, just like that, erased from the succession plan like chalk on a rain-soaked slate. Valdemar II, crushed but stubborn, went on to rule for another 2 decades, but he never fully recovered. He appointed his next son, Eric, as co-king. Eric would become Eric IV, but that's another tragic story, ending in assassination and betrayal. The whole Valdemarian succession reads like a script from a Shakespeare tragedy that someone spilled beer on and then restaged with more blood. Here's your quirky fact. Some modern Danish scholars still debate whether Valdemar the Young's death was an accident or a carefully masked political execution. Denmark's royal court wasn't exactly a trustful environment, and accidents involving nobles, especially ambitious young co-kings, have a way of being suspiciously well-timed. A few enthusiasts have even looked into local folklore and regional sagas for clues, but there's never been a definitive answer, just a lot of speculation and one very abrupt ending. The academic debate mostly focuses on his potential, what kind of king he could have been. Was he truly a reform-minded future monarch? Or was he just another dynastic placeholder with a decent tailor and good posture? The problem is, we'll never know. His reign was too short to produce any real policy, any defining wars, any major decisions. He was a king without a chance to fail, unless you count the biggest failure of all, dying before you can even try. And so, Valdemar the Young earns his place in this royal disaster parade not because of poor decisions, but because even with all the preparation, pomp and potential, the whole thing ended with a twitch of a trigger and a sudden silence in the woods. It's a reminder that medieval power wasn't just about cleverness or cruelty. Sometimes it was just about whether someone in your hunting party remembered to aim properly. So now we close the hunting grounds, lower the royal banner, and pack away the illusions of dynastic certainty. Next we head south to the Italian peninsula, where a boy emperor named Otto III thought he could resurrect ancient Rome, until reality politely then rudely told him no. Now let's wander south into the patchwork of duchies, fiefdoms and restless city-states that made up the Italian peninsula around the turn of the first millennium. A land that still whispers about emperors, gladiators and the shadow of Rome. Long gone, but never quite forgotten. Into this landscape of crumbling grandeur and papal power struggles comes a young, wildly ambitious dreamer named Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor who decided he was going to bring back the Roman Empire. Like the Roman Empire. Never mind that it had already been dead for 500 years. Otto was convinced he could reboot ancient greatness with a little German efficiency, a lot of piety, and, spoiler alert, almost zero practical awareness of how anything south of the Alps actually worked. Otto was born in 980 to Otto II, the reigning Holy Roman Emperor, and Theophanu, a Byzantine princess who brought a nice dose of Eastern culture, elegance, and very expensive taste to the already gold-heavy German court. From the beginning, Otto III was a political unicorn, a blend of German imperial muscle and Byzantine ceremonial flair. His mother raised him on tales of emperors and saints, and as soon as he could string sentences together, he was dreaming of thrones, togas, and a reborn empire led by himself, obviously because who else could do it? He became king as a literal toddler, age 3, after his father died suddenly during an ill-timed military campaign in Italy. His mother ruled as regent, and she wasn't bad at it. In fact, Theophanu's regency is remembered as unusually stable. But when she died in 991, Otto was still a teen, and control of the empire passed to a series of advisors, bishops, and noble relatives, none of whom shared Otto's obsession with classical grandeur. Still, he soaked up every drop of classical learning he could find. He read Latin, pored over church law, studied the early church fathers. While most nobles were perfecting the art of beer-to-battle transitions, Otto was quoting Cicero and dreaming of a spiritual and political utopia. At age 16, he officially took the reins of power. Most teenagers get a learner's permit. Otto got a crown and a dysfunctional empire. In 996, he marched into Italy to settle a dispute over the papacy, and for a brief, dazzling moment, everything seemed to go his way. He installed his cousin as Pope Gregory V, the first German pope, cementing his authority in Rome and making it clear that Otto saw himself not just as king or emperor, but as God's agent on earth. He even coined a new title, Servant of Jesus Christ, which sounds nice until you remember it came with a sword, a political agenda, and a highly selective sense of humility. Then came the construction projects. Otto tried to remake Rome in his vision, restoring ruins, reviving Senate traditions, and reshaping imperial ceremony. He styled his court on ancient Roman models and tried to get his contemporaries to treat him as both Caesar and priest-king. It was the medieval version of a cosplay obsession that got way out of hand. He wasn't just playing emperor, he genuinely believed he could blend Christian virtue with Roman imperial glory and lead Europe into a new golden age. But here's the thing, Italy didn't care, the Roman aristocracy wasn't impressed. The Pope might have been a puppet, but the clergy were cranky about Otto's constant meddling. The local nobles, especially in central and southern Italy, saw him as a German teenager with delusions of grandeur and zero understanding of local politics. They weren't going to play toga party just because he rolled in with a crown and a bad case of classical nostalgia. Things started to fall apart quickly. Pope Gregory V died young, and Otto replaced him with Sylvester VI, a brilliant scholar and fellow idealist. But still, the resistance grew. Southern Italy, especially the Greek-influenced parts, saw Otto's New Rome project as an outsider fantasy. Rebellions flared, cities refused taxes. Otto's own imperial nobility back in Germany was getting nervous too. He was spending all his time and resources on Rome while the empire up north was beginning to crack under regional pressures. In 1002, at the ripe old age of 21, Otto died suddenly near Rome. Possibly from malaria, possibly from a mysterious illness no one could identify. His body was hurriedly shipped back to Aachen, buried without the fanfare he'd have written for himself, and his dream of reviving Rome died with him. The classical-inspired court vanished. His reforms unravelled. Within a year, his successor, Henry II, was trying to reassert control over Germany and let most of the Italian fantasy quietly fade into memory. And here's your quirky detail. Otto had a weird fixation with holy relics. He collected them obsessively and kept a strange, almost saintly image of himself. At one point, he reportedly tried to sleep near the tomb of Charlemagne, hoping to absorb some of the dead emperor's greatness. It's a deeply medieval kind of logic, osmosis via corpse proximity. If nothing else, Otto had commitment. Scholars still argue whether Otto was a visionary or a naive fool. On one hand, he was one of the most intellectually gifted emperors of the medieval era, a multilingual reformer who really did want to unite church and empire under a single moral vision. On the other hand, he had no grip on realpolitik, no patience for compromise, and no clear idea of how to keep nobles loyal while chasing ghosts of Rome. He was a man out of time, born 5 centuries too late for his ambitions, and about 10 IQ points above the average medieval noble's tolerance for philosophical monologues. So we close Otto's chapter with a Latin quote etched in your memory, Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, renewal of the Roman Empire. It was his motto, his dream, and like so many idealistic monarchs before and after, he died chasing it, leaving behind a court that couldn't keep the candles lit once he was gone. Next up, we jump from Rome's ghost to France's genealogy nightmare. Charles IV, a king whose reign wasn't especially dumb, but did manage to end an entire dynasty and kick off a war that would last a literal century. Yes, it's time for the man who sparked the 100 Years' War without even meaning to. Now we land in early 14th century France, where the Capetian dynasty, the line that had ruled France for over 300 years, was quietly running out of gas. Enter Charles IV, the last Capetian king, who came to the throne in 1322 and ruled for just 6 years. He wasn't a warlord, a maniac, or an especially scandalous figure by medieval standards. But what Charles IV did do, mostly by accident, was end a centuries-old royal line, ignite one of the longest and bloodiest wars in European history, and leave a throne so tangled in an inheritance drama that it made Game of Thrones look like a family brunch gone slightly awkward. And the wild part? He seemed to do it without breaking a sweat. Charles IV was the third son of Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, who had ruled France with cold brilliance, if not much warmth. Philip the Fair had 3 sons, Louis VI, Philip V and Charles IV, and each of them one by one took a turn as king. Unfortunately, each of them also managed to reign with the reproductive success of a damp candle. Charles IV's reign would be the final nail in the Capetian coffin. Let's rewind to the beginning of Charles's rule. He ascended the throne in 1322 after the death of his brother, Philip V. Like his brother before him, Charles inherited a country still reeling from scandal, famine, and a creeping sense that the royal line was cursed. His brother Louis the Thin had died under suspicious circumstances, some say poisoned, after locking up his wife in a tower for alleged adultery. That scandal, by the way, is part of the Tour de Nesle affair, where multiple royal wives were accused of sleeping with knights and commoners. It's like a medieval soap opera, except nobody's doing the laundry and half the cast ends up in prison. Charles tried to stabilise things. He reaffirmed royal authority, passed some sensible reforms, and even improved the coinage system. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't especially cruel. He was, if anything, adequate. But the problem wasn't in his policies. It was in his bedroom. Charles married 3 times, and by the end of his life he had only a single daughter. No sons, no male heir. And this, in medieval Europe, was the political equivalent of rolling a grenade across the royal council table and walking away. Now here's where it gets messy. France, following Salic law, had a big rule: no woman could inherit the throne, and, this part's key, no man could claim the throne through a woman either. So Charles's daughter was out. Which meant that the Capetian dynasty, stretching back to 987, was suddenly out of direct male heirs. The throne passed instead to Philip of Valois, Charles's cousin, launching the House of Valois as the new ruling dynasty. Easy, right? Except it wasn't. Because across the English Channel sat Edward III of England, whose mother, Isabella, just happened to be Charles IV's sister. Edward thought that, as the grandson of Philip IV through the female line, he had a stronger claim to the French throne than Philip of Valois. The French said, "Nice try, but no uterus-based succession, remember?" Edward said, "Fine," then quietly sharpened his swords for 10 years before kicking off what would become the 100 Years' War. So Charles IV's biggest contribution to history, accidentally lighting the fuse on over a century of war that would devastate both France and England, decimate generations of soldiers and civilians, and give birth to national identities forged in blood and tax hikes. Not exactly the legacy you want on your tombstone. Here's your quirky fact. Charles IV was actually King of Navarre too. He inherited the crown through his mother and ruled the tiny mountain kingdom nestled between France and Spain. Navarre had a long history of slipping between dynasties, and Charles's rule there was considered stable and uneventful, which is to say, it was one of the only places in his life where things didn't completely implode. After his death, Navarre passed to his daughter, because apparently Navarre didn't get the Salic law memo. And here's the real scholarly tension. Was Salic law enforced so strictly just to block Edward III? Or was it always a hard rule waiting to be invoked? Some historians argue the French twisted the law to keep the crown from falling into English hands, conveniently rewriting their inheritance principles on the fly. Others insist that male-only succession was the norm all along, and that Edward's claim was always a stretch. Either way, the result was carnage. Whether Charles intended to or not, he left behind a legal minefield and a power vacuum the size of a kingdom. Charles died in 1328 at the age of 33, likely from natural causes, although some rumours circulated about illness or poisoning, because let's be honest, in royal courts, people drop like flies and no one ever just quietly expires. He was buried with dignity, the last of the direct Capetian kings, the final son of Philip the Fair. No dramatic last words, no fanfare, just a quiet end to a long and loud bloodline. And so Charles IV walks into our pantheon of failed or unlucky kings, not because he was evil or idiotic, but because sometimes even the best intentions crumble under the weight of history and inconvenient biology. You can have all the power, all the paperwork, and all the best royal portraits, but if you can't produce a male heir in medieval France, your entire lineage might as well have been written in chalk during a rainstorm. Now we ride northward again, into Scotland, where a cannon explodes, a leg flies through the air, and a king becomes a footnote in gunpowder history. Get ready for the short but dramatic final act of James II of Scotland, the only monarch we'll meet tonight who was literally blown up by his own weapon. If medieval monarchy was a dangerous job, and it most definitely was, then James II of Scotland managed to find one of the most creative, most explosive ways to leave the world stage. Tonight's story is not about a reign full of silly mistakes or royal laziness. No, James II was actually a fairly energetic and determined king, but his story ends in a flash of fire and flying metal, which is what happens when you stand too close to an experimental cannon in the middle of a siege and forget that gunpowder doesn't care about your noble blood. Let's start from the top. James II was born in 1430 into a kingdom that barely functioned like one. His father, James I, had returned to Scotland after 18 years as a prisoner in England, full of reformist ideas and a little too much confidence. He was assassinated in front of his wife and court in 1437, and 6-year-old James II inherited the throne with all the excitement and understanding of a child being handed the keys to a flaming carriage. The Scottish nobility, used to doing whatever they wanted, saw the king's youth as a green light to return to murder, power-grabbing and endless feuds. So James II's early reign was basically the adult version of royal daycare. He was watched, manipulated and paraded around like a political mascot. Different factions vied for control. At one point he was physically seized by the Livingston family, who ran the royal household like it was their personal court. Then the Douglas family, Scotland's most powerful noble house, took a turn as puppet masters. James grew up surrounded by plots, whispered threats, and the constant reminder that most people around him would rather use him than follow him. But then James hit adolescence and decided to hit back. By his mid-teens he began asserting control. In a bold move he had William Crichton and Alexander Livingston arrested and stripped of power. Then, in one of medieval Scotland's most infamous episodes, he orchestrated the Black Dinner of 1440. 2 young Douglas boys, sons of the late Earl, were invited to dine with the king in Edinburgh Castle. After a pleasant meal, a black bull's head, symbol of death, was brought out on a platter. The boys were dragged away and executed in the courtyard while teenage James looked on, possibly horrified, possibly already learning what it meant to survive in this world. From that point on, James II ruled with growing confidence and no shortage of grudges. His adult reign saw determined efforts to strengthen the monarchy against overmighty nobles, especially the Douglases. He passed laws centralising authority, tried to curb baronial power and improve tax collection. He also had a fierce temper and a violent streak. In 1452, in a famously savage scene, he personally stabbed William Douglas, the 8th Earl, during a meeting at Stirling Castle after accusing him of treason. His attendants finished the job, and the body was flung out a window. Subtlety was not James's strong suit. Despite the bloodshed, James managed to restore significant royal authority. He married Mary of Guelders, a well-connected European princess, and formed a solid alliance with Burgundy. He focused on internal development, minting more stable coinage, encouraging trade, and beginning the slow process of modernising the kingdom's infrastructure. But the king wasn't done proving himself. He also wanted military glory, and that's where it all goes up in smoke. In 1460, James launched a campaign to capture Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English-held strongholds inside Scotland. The siege was symbolic, a final push to erase English presence and prove his reign was strong, just and victorious. And it should have worked. The Scottish army was massive, morale was high, the castle was well within reach. But then came the cannon. Artillery was still new and wildly unpredictable in the 15th century. Cannons often misfired, cracked, or exploded. And medieval gunners operated these beasts with all the careful attention of men who had no idea how any of it actually worked. On August 3rd, 1460, while observing the bombardment, James stood too close to one of the guns, and right then, as if history had been waiting to make a grim joke, the cannon exploded. Shrapnel tore into the king, reportedly mangling his leg so severely it killed him almost instantly. He died on the spot right in front of his army while besieging a castle that surrendered just a few days later. The kicker. His young son, just 9 years old, was immediately crowned James III on the battlefield, under a makeshift tent, and Mary of Guelders, his now widowed queen, took over as regent, continuing the siege until it was completed. It was one of the few moments in Scottish history where the line of succession moved on with barely a hiccup, even as the body of the previous king was still cooling beside a twisted hunk of iron. Your fringe fact: the very cannon that killed James II was supposedly nicknamed the Lion, not because it roared, but because it had decorative lion motifs carved into the barrel, a reminder that even in medieval warfare, aesthetics still mattered. It's unclear if that specific gun survived the blast, but the moment became legendary in Scotland. To this day, James remains the only monarch in European history known to have been killed by his own artillery. And here's where the scholarly conversation gets interesting. Was James II a failure? Not exactly. He was brutal, impulsive, and often short-sighted, but he was also effective. He beat back noble overreach, strengthened the throne, and left the kingdom more centralised than he found it. His death, while absurdly dramatic, wasn't the result of policy blunders or diplomatic idiocy. It was just a terribly timed demonstration of new military technology. A freak accident. But in a way it's fitting. James II lived fast, ruled hard, and died in a fireball of ambition and iron. So let's pack up the siege engines and roll away from Roxburgh, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder, a smoking crater, and a crown handed down over the body of a king who maybe stood a little too close to progress. Up next, a royal whose entire reign was less about conquest and more about paperwork. Lothair II, whose most passionate battlefield was a medieval divorce court, and whose love life made a mess of politics, papal relations, and historical memory. Some kings conquered empires, others were conquered by cannons, but Lothair II of Lotharingia, he was conquered by his libido, his bad judgment, and the uniquely medieval horror that was ecclesiastical marriage law. This is the story of a king who spent his entire reign fighting not on the battlefield, but in a royal bedroom, in front of bishops, popes, and every clergyman with a spare opinion. His reign, which should have been about solidifying Carolingian power in a region teetering between order and anarchy, instead turned into the world's most frustrating annulment saga. It's part soap opera, part church scandal, and all the proof you need that being king didn't mean you got to run your own love life, not when Rome was watching. Let's drop you into the year 855, when Lothair, grandson of Charlemagne, dies and splits his realm, Middle Francia, among his 3 sons. These boys get handed some of the least coherent pieces of land imaginable. Lothair II inherits Lotharingia, which sprawls across what is now eastern France, the Low Countries, Luxembourg, parts of western Germany, and basically every area where people speak a slightly different dialect every 5 miles. It's a beautiful mess of cultures, customs, and noble families who all think they should be in charge. Now, Lothair II is young, early 20s, and married off to Teutberga, a noble woman chosen to help unify the kingdom and solidify ties with the Burgundian nobility. The marriage was arranged, political, and doomed from the first awkward toast. Lothair, to put it plainly, didn't like her, and by didn't like we mean he actively resented her existence and immediately began trying to get out of the whole thing. Problem was, by the time he really started making a fuss, she'd already been crowned queen, not just a wife, a queen. Divorce wasn't just a personal decision, it was a constitutional crisis. Lothair's real love was Waldrada, a noble woman who he may have been seeing even before he married Teutberga. She was everything Teutberga wasn't: charming, politically useful in the local aristocracy, and more importantly, not Teutberga. Lothair wanted to dump his queen, marry Waldrada, and legitimize their children. The problem? The church. Divorce wasn't something you just filed and forgot in medieval Europe, especially not if you were king. So Lothair tried Plan A. Publicly accused Teutberger of incest and unnatural acts. Yep, he had her arrested and put on trial for supposedly having sexual relations with her brother. The charges were outrageous, and even in the jaded world of medieval politics, eyebrows went up so fast they practically launched into orbit. Teutberger, to her immense credit, survived a trial by ordeal, a terrifying custom where she was forced to carry red-hot irons to prove her innocence. She passed. Whether this was divine intervention, trickery, or sheer stubbornness, it meant the church had to clear her name. That should have been the end of it. Lothair should have backed off, pretended to be a decent husband, and found a more subtle way to undermine his wife's dignity. But no, he doubled down. He threw political weight behind bishops who were friendly to his cause, staged multiple church synods to rubber stamp an annulment, and essentially tried to wear the church down by sheer force of persistence. This dragged on for years. While other kings were fortifying borders or fighting off Vikings, Lothair was composing legal petitions and assembling bishops like a man obsessed with getting out of date night forever. Then came Pope Nicholas I, who took one look at Lothair's case and said basically, absolutely not. Nicholas was one of the first popes to really assert the power of Rome over kings when it came to moral authority. He annulled the annulment, excommunicated Lothair's bishops, and forced Teutberger back into her role as queen. It was one of the earliest and most famous examples of the papacy overruling royal will, and it set a precedent that would haunt monarchs all the way into the Reformation. Lothair was furious, humiliated, and still married, but he couldn't openly defy the Pope without risking full-scale rebellion from within and condemnation from without. So he played the long game, waited for Nicholas to die, which finally happened in 867, then tried again under the more pliable Pope Adrian II. Things looked like they might swing his way. He even made the journey to Italy to personally plead his case. But irony being what it is, Lothair fell ill and died suddenly before Adrian could give him a formal answer. Just like that, a man who spent nearly his entire reign trying to get a divorce never actually succeeded. His kingdom collapsed almost immediately after his death, parcelled out by the relatives and swallowed by larger powers. While Drada faded from the record, Teutberger went into retirement, probably tired of being dragged through every courtroom and chapel in Europe. And Lotharingia? It became one of medieval Europe's most heavily disputed regions, a buffer zone tossed between France and Germany for centuries. You can thank Lothair for that too. Instead of unifying his kingdom through stability or reform, he let it fracture over an obsession with personal legitimacy. Here's your quirky fact. Some of the bishops who supported Lothair's annulment were bribed with land, titles, and what we'd now call hush money. One of them, Archbishop Gunther of Cologne, became infamous for using church resources to host lavish feasts where he toasted Lothair's freedom from that woman. He was later excommunicated. Medieval clerical drama makes modern office gossip look like amateur hour. Scholars continue to debate Lothair's motives. Was he a romantic, trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate to legitimize his true family? Or was he a political schemer using marriage as a battlefield to eliminate an inconvenient alliance? Either way, the result was the same. A fractured kingdom, a wasted reign, and a historical reputation as a king who governed more in bedchambers and bishoprics than on actual thrones. So now we gently close the door on the royal divorce trial from hell, and look ahead to a king whose final blunder wasn't about marriage, it was about geography. Louis II of Hungary, a man who died not from battle wounds but from drowning in full armour while trying to retreat. You'd think someone would have warned him that rivers are not good places to flee on horseback in steel plate. Let's take a moment to appreciate how deeply medieval warfare disrespected common sense. Horses were sent into battle wearing iron pyjamas, messengers were expected to gallop for miles with zero hydration, and kings, oh the kings, charged headlong into disaster with all the grace of cannonballs in a cathedral. And of all the royal battlefield blunders, few were as tragically absurd as the final moments of Louis II of Hungary. A king who lost not only his throne, not only his army, but his life, by drowning in a river while wearing full-plate armour. It's one of those deaths that feels so ironic, you half expect a court jester to jump out of the reeds and yell, "Too soon?" Louis VIII was born in 1506, smack in the middle of a boiling European stew pot. He inherited both the Kingdom of Hungary and Bohemia while still a toddler, after the untimely death of his father Vladislaus II. He became king at the tender age of 10, which meant real power landed squarely in the laps of the Hungarian nobility, who immediately did what nobles do best when a child is on the throne: fight among themselves, ignore taxes, and leave the treasury emptier than a peasant's pantry. By the time Louis reached adulthood, Hungary was a mess. The treasury was bankrupt, the army was underfunded, and the nobles were more interested in local feuds than defending the kingdom's borders. And right on the horizon, the Ottoman Empire, with its massive professional army, endless resources, and a sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, who very much wanted to punch a hole through Europe, starting with Hungary. Louis was 20 years old in 1526 when the storm finally hit. To be fair, he tried. He scrambled to raise an army, begged help from European allies, who mostly replied with the medieval equivalent of "good luck, buddy," and rode out to face the Ottomans at the Battle of Mohacs. It would be his first major battle, and his last. The Hungarian army was outnumbered and outmanoeuvred almost from the first trumpet call. The Ottomans had cannons, elite infantry, disciplined tactics. Hungary had nobles showing up late, a scattered command structure, and Louis trying desperately to rally troops who were basically winging it. The battle lasted all of 2 hours. The Hungarian army was annihilated. Noblemen died by the dozens. Whole units disappeared into the marshes, trampled and skewered. And Louis fled. No shame in that. Many kings have fled losing battles. But this is where the story takes its final fateful dip. In his heavy armour, with chaos behind him and fear ahead, Louis galloped from the field, trying to cross a small, rain-swollen stream, the Sile River. Maybe his horse slipped. Maybe he tried to leap it. Maybe he thought it was shallower than it was. Whatever the case, Louis plunged into the water, weighed down by steel from head to toe. His armour dragged him straight to the bottom like an anchor made of royal bad decisions. His body was found the next day, lifeless, still wearing the armour that had protected him from everything but gravity. He was 20 years old. That single death did more than just end a reign. It collapsed the entire political structure of Hungary. There was no heir, no plan, no stability. The nobility immediately split into factions. Some supported Ferdinand of Habsburg, who had married Louis's sister, while others backed a local noble, John Zapolya, who had the support of the Ottomans. The country fragmented into civil war, and Hungary, once a proud bulwark of Christian Europe, became a battleground between East and West for the next century and a half. And the truly bizarre part? Louis's own people barely had time to mourn him before vultures, both literal and political, started circling. The Habsburgs swept in, claiming chunks of his kingdom. The Ottomans took Buda, the heart of the realm. Louis hadn't just died, he detonated a dynastic implosion on his way down. Here's your quirky detail. Louis was so young when he took the throne that his royal seals had to be specially designed to reflect his minority. Official letters from the early years often had annotations explaining that the king couldn't yet sign for himself. In fact, his entire reign was marked by a strange mixture of royal imagery and real-world impotence. Every portrait painted with a sword, while the actual man was begging for foreign aid and being undermined by his own court. As for scholarly takes, they've been surprisingly gentle on Louis. Many historians view him as a tragic figure, rather than a true failure. He inherited a deeply flawed state, ruled during a period of immense pressure, and never had the time, or the advisors, to set things right. Was he militarily inexperienced? Definitely. Was he naive? Without question. But he also didn't have much choice. When Suleiman pointed his armies westward, Hungary was always going to be the first domino. Still the image lingers. A young king running from a battle he couldn't win, dragged under by the very armour that symbolised his status. It's poetic, morbid, and deeply medieval. A sovereign swallowed not by an enemy's sword, but by water and fear and steel. You can't write that kind of symbolism unless you're history and you have a flair for the dramatic. So now we wade gently away from the muddy waters of the Saale, leaving behind a reign cut short, a kingdom left in pieces, and a legacy that echoes less through triumph than through sheer tragic timing. Coming up next is a man who ruled for longer, but whose mental state became so fragile he literally believed he was made of glass. Yes, it's time for Charles VI of France, a monarch who made his entire court walk softly, because if they bumped into him, he thought he might shatter. And now, let's dim the torchlight and step quietly into the shadowed corridors of medieval France, where whispers trail behind velvet robes and every footstep echoes a little too loudly. This is the court of Charles VI, King of France from 1380 to 1422, a man who began his reign with promise and ended it believing he was made of glass. Not metaphorically, literally. He believed that if someone touched him too roughly, or if he bumped into furniture, he'd shatter into glittering shards. And while that's an undeniably haunting image, Charles's reign wasn't just eerie, it was catastrophic. His breakdown didn't just ruin dinner parties, it helped fracture France itself and played a massive part in plunging the kingdom into civil war and English occupation. Charles became king at just 11 years old, after the death of his father, Charles V, who had actually been one of France's better rulers, stable, reform-minded, and serious about governance. The young Charles VI, by contrast, had all the glittering makings of a fairy tale monarch. He was handsome, athletic, well-dressed, and deeply adored by the people. They even called him Charles the Beloved in his early years, and for a while it looked like the crown had landed on the right head. Except that head had cracks. In the early years, France was governed by the Charles's uncles, particularly the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Anjou, who did what most royal uncles in regencies do, bled the treasury dry and launched expensive, pointless campaigns. When Charles came of age, he took the reins back from them and began his rule with fire and flair. He dismissed corrupt advisors, reasserted royal authority, and threw a string of lavish public events that dazzled the Parisians. For a minute, France had hope. The 100 Years' War had paused, the plague had retreated, and the king seemed both willing and able to rule. Then the cracks widened. In 1392, while riding through a forest in Brittany on a military campaign, Charles suddenly snapped. A madman had approached him days earlier, shouting that he'd be betrayed by his own men. Whether that planted the seed or simply coincided with his mental collapse, we don't know. But on that ride, Charles turned on his own knights and began hacking at them with a sword. He killed at least one and had to be restrained by his brother. It was the first of many episodes, and they never really stopped. After that, the man who'd been Charles the Beloved became Charles the Mad. He suffered repeated mental breakdowns over the next 3 decades. Sometimes he couldn't recognize his wife or children. Other times he ran screaming through the halls, claiming he was being attacked by enemies only he could see. Once, he refused to bathe or change clothes for 5 straight months. But the most infamous delusion? His belief that he was made of glass. He wore specially reinforced clothing to prevent shattering, and he forbade people from touching him. He would sit motionless for hours to avoid breaking himself. Courtiers were instructed to move gently around him, and his physicians could do little but scribble confused notes and recommend sleep. Now, in a modern context, this sounds like textbook schizophrenia, or possibly bipolar disorder, though some historians have floated epilepsy, or even porphyria or as possibilities. Whatever it was, it incapacitated him, and France paid the price. Because while Charles wandered the halls thinking he might break like a wine goblet, someone had to run the country. That duty fell to rival factions, namely the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, 2 noble houses who used Charles's condition as an excuse to fight over power like wolves over a bone. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to hold things together, but her influence was questioned constantly. She was accused of infidelity, corruption, and being under the sway of whichever faction seemed stronger that week. The French court turned into a paranoia-fueled battleground where alliances shifted hourly, and no one could agree on what Charles had said, because Charles, more often than not, was sitting in a corner buttering to himself. Meanwhile, the English noticed the chaos and began licking their chops. Charles's mental collapse and the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians gave Henry V of England the perfect excuse to resume hostilities in the 100 Years' War. In 1415, he landed in France and crushed the French nobility at Agincourt, where mud, longbows and overconfidence did most of the work. The French lost thousands. Charles, unable to respond in any coherent way, did nothing. But the worst blow came in 1420, with the signing of the Treaty of Troyes. In a move that stunned even those used to royal treachery, Charles's court agreed to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin Charles, future Charles VII, and declared that Henry V of England would inherit the French crown upon Charles VI's death. This was partly due to pressure from the Burgundians, and partly because Charles, by this point, was only king in the ceremonial sense. The English were now positioned to rule both kingdoms, and France was officially broken into pieces. Your quirky fact. Charles once ordered the construction of an enormous indoor menagerie in Paris, filled with exotic animals like leopards and camels, because even in delusion he still enjoyed spectacle. There are also rumours that he believed his lions could talk, though that may be more court gossip than historical fact. Either way, the mood at court was often surreal. A mad king with glass delusions entertaining guests with giraffes while half the country burned. Scholars have long debated what exactly Charles VI suffered from. There's strong evidence of hereditary mental illness. His descendants, especially in the Habsburg line, would struggle with similar issues. Some have even called him a victim of medieval medicine, pummeled with purges and potions that only made things worse. But more broadly, Charles's madness became a symbol of France's decline during the late medieval period. A king who thought he was fragile as crystal, while his kingdom shattered for real. When Charles finally died in 1428, Paris was in English hands. The Dauphin had been declared illegitimate, and the crown was tangled in treaties and claims from across the Channel. France's survival was now a long shot, and it would take a teenage peasant girl from Domremy wearing armour and hearing voices to turn the tide. But that's another story. As for Charles, his tomb reads like any other king's, but his legacy is a sombre reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy to a kingdom is not invasion or rebellion, but the slow, silent corrosion of the mind. Next we'll look at a royal reign that lasted just 5 days. That's right. A baby named John Pons of France came into this world with a crown and was dead before he ever got a chance to use it. Hope you like medieval mystery, because this one's packed with conspiracy theories and royal suspicion. Some monarchs fail through poor leadership, others lose their grip through mental collapse or catastrophic battles. But then there are those who barely even get a chance to exist, let alone rule. Tonight's royal flameout is so brief you could miss it if you blinked too hard. Meet John I of France, also known, depending on how you want to slice your medieval drama, as John the Posthumous, the only king in French history who was born a monarch and died before he ever saw a throne room. His reign lasted exactly 5 days. That's not a poetic exaggeration, that's the historical record. 5 days. Long enough to inherit a realm, not long enough to figure out what a realm even is. Let's rewind to 1316, during one of the most unstable periods in Capetian France. King Louis III, John's father, had just died unexpectedly, possibly from a fever, possibly poisoned, possibly just one of those medieval he suddenly stopped breathing and nobody asked questions situations. Louis had been on the throne for less than 2 years, and his reign was mostly notable for locking up his wife in the Tour de Nesle scandal. You remember the one? Adultery, royal embarrassment, knights doing a little too much fraternising, and then trying to annul the marriage. He succeeded, sort of, and then immediately married again to Clementia of Hungary, who was pregnant when he died. Which brings us to the royal baby John Forsus, born on November 15th, 1316, in the Louvre Palace in Paris. He was immediately proclaimed King of France. Even as he was being cleaned off and swaddled, messengers were spreading the news. The crown had passed to a newborn, no regency vote, no gap in the line. The Capetian dynasty had survived again, by a thread. But the court was already squirming, because while John technically inherited the throne the moment he was born, there was a whole lot of anxious eye contact between nobles. The baby's uncle, Philip the Tall, was very interested in the idea that maybe France wasn't ready for a king who couldn't yet control his neck muscles. Philip, as Louis VI's younger brother, had a pretty solid backup claim, and he was already quietly working the angles just in case things went sideways, and they did. On November 20th, 5 days after his birth, baby King John I died. The official explanation? Natural causes, which is medieval shorthand for something happened and nobody wants to poke the corpse too hard. There were whispers from the start that the baby had been sickly, that he'd been born weak, that he'd stopped breathing suddenly, as infants tragically often did. But there were also darker murmurs, that he had been murdered, that someone in court, perhaps someone whose initials rhymed with Philip the Tall, had ensured the infant didn't live long enough to cause a royal succession crisis. Because the moment John died, Philip Samku stepped in and claimed the throne as Philip V, asserting that the law barred any inheritance through the female line, thus excluding John's half-sister Joan, and that his succession was now the only clear option. This was the first major invocation of Salic law, that infamous clause barring women from the French throne and from transmitting claims to male descendants. If that law sounds familiar, it's because it comes up constantly in French royal disputes, and it starts here, with the suspiciously brief reign of a baby king and an uncle who stepped up with suspicious efficiency. Now here's where things get really spicy. A few decades after John's death, a rumour circulated that he hadn't died at all, that he had been smuggled out of the palace and replaced with a dead infant. The real John, it was claimed, had been raised in secrecy and would one day return to claim his throne. Sound familiar? That's right. It's the medieval Anastasia story, only this one came with slightly more monks and slightly fewer animated musicals. A man named Gianfieschi, an Italian noble, later claimed to be the grown-up John the First and tried to stir up support for his claim in Provence. He was laughed off the stage, politically speaking, but the story persisted in folklore for centuries. Historians are virtually unanimous that it was a hoax. Still, the idea that the posthumous king might have lived echoed in everything from peasant ballads to dusty legal scrolls. Here's your quirky fact. John's reign, if you can call it that, is technically the shortest of any crowned French monarch, and yet he's still included in royal lists. That means you'll find him, wedged awkwardly between Louis the Bix and Philip V like a punctuation mark no one wants to delete. His reign was short, but not forgotten. His name was inscribed in royal archives, coinage was minted in his honour, and his death prompted theological debates about kingship and divine will. After all, what kind of god grants a crown to a newborn and then takes him 5 days later? Scholars still ponder what might have happened had John lived. Would the Capetian dynasty have followed a different trajectory? Would Salic law have been delayed, or never invoked at all? Would the 100 Years' War have played out differently if English and French succession lines hadn't clashed so fiercely over female inheritance claims? It's a lot of what-ifs balanced on the tiny shoulders of a baby who never got the chance to breathe outside palace walls. John Hopcorn is a king in name, more myth than monarch. His crown weighed nothing, his sceptre was symbolic. And yet his life, brief as it was, set off legal, dynastic and political aftershocks that would define France for the next century. That's not failure exactly. It's something stranger, something haunting, a reign measured not in deeds, but in doubts. So now we leave the cradle where France's briefest king once lay. His tiny crown barely cooled before it passed to the next man. Speaking of which, let's talk about Charles the Bald, a king whose nickname undersells just how hairy his problems really were. Constant wars, backstabbing the nobles, and possibly the worst hairstyle in Carolingian Europe. You'll see. Now let's run a comb through the tangled mess that was Charles the Bald, a king who wasn't necessarily incompetent, just consistently overwhelmed, undermined, and outmaneuvered by almost everyone he knew. His nickname has been the subject of endless debate because depending on which source you trust, Charles may not have been bald at all. Some say the term calvus, Latin for bald, was more symbolic than descriptive, referring not to his scalp but to his lack of land, power, or maybe even dignity. Either way, Charles the Bald spent his entire reign trying to hold together a crumbling kingdom with a crown that barely fit and a sword that never seemed quite sharp enough. He was born in 823 as the youngest son of Louis the Pious, the son of none other than Charlemagne, which should have guaranteed Charles a life of power and reverence. Instead, it landed him in the middle of the most exhausting family drama in Carolingian history. When Louis the Pious died, he split the empire among his sons like he was dealing out cards in a game of territorial poker, and Charles, being the baby of the family, got the worst hand. His older brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Pepin, were already firmly in control of large regions, and they didn't appreciate Charles being suddenly handed West Francia, the kingdom that would eventually become modern France. Cue years of brutal fraternal warfare. Charles was barely out of adolescence before he was raising armies against his own brothers, trying to hold on to the scraps of Charlemagne's empire like a raccoon clinging to a broken treasure chest. His biggest turning point came with the Treaty of Verdun in 843. It sliced the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts: East Francia, Louis the German, Middle Francia, Lothair, and West Francia, Charles. It was supposed to bring peace, Instead, it lit the fuse for another century of feuding, fragmentation, and dynastic dysfunction. From there, Charles spent his reign playing medieval whack-a-mole. Nobles rebelled, smash one, bribe another. Vikings raiding the coasts, quickly raise taxes, then bribe them too. Lothair trying to assert dominance again, prepare another army and pray the other brothers aren't about to flip sides. He barely had time to sit down before someone else was trying to carve a piece off his kingdom or march their problems across his border. Speaking of Vikings, Charles had some of the worst luck of any Frankish king when it came to Norse invasions. These weren't just little hit-and-run raids, these were massive organised fleets sailing up rivers, burning monasteries, sacking towns, and demanding massive Danegeld payments to leave. One particularly humiliating episode came in 845, when a fleet led by the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, yes, that Ragnar, sailed up the Seine and captured Paris. Charles, with no functioning army in the region, had no choice but to pay a ransom of £7,000 of silver to send them away. And what did the Vikings do with all that silver? Probably built more boats, probably came back, but even as he was losing cities and handing over literal mountains of silver to men wearing bearskins and helmet wings, Charles kept trying. He restructured parts of his administration, granted church lands in exchange for loyalty, and attempted to create a standing army, which in theory would have been a step toward modern statehood. In practice, the nobility preferred their own little feudal fiefdoms, and every attempt at royal reform ended up watered down or ignored. Now, let's talk about his most awkward moment, his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 875. After the death of his nephew Louis II, Charles rode down to Italy, threw on a show of imperial dignity, and had himself crowned by the Pope. For a few months, he strutted like Charlemagne's ghost, convinced he could rule both France and Italy. Then the wheels came off. The Italians hated him. The local nobility turned on him. The campaign was a disaster, and Charles returned north humiliated and poorer than ever. His imperial crown was little more than a piece of shiny headwear. And let's not forget the church. Charles tried desperately to get papal approval for various schemes, taxations, alliances, and once even a proposed imperial marriage, but the popes of the time were busy playing their own game of survival amid the chaos of Rome. Charles got some grudging support, but never the divine glow he desperately wanted. He was the guy at the party who kept raising his glass for a toast nobody wanted to join. Here's your quirky fact. Despite the chaos, Charles was actually a bit of a literary nerd. He commissioned illuminated manuscripts, had a deep respect for scholars, and once received a glowing tribute from John Scotus Eriugena, a philosopher he brought to court. Charles liked to think of himself as a protector of learning, though unfortunately you can't throw books at Viking longboats. As for his death, fittingly underwhelming. In 877, while leading yet another military expedition into Italy, Charles fell ill and died, possibly from a fever, possibly from stress, possibly just from being too tired to deal with everything anymore. He died on the road, abandoned by many of his nobles, and left his kingdom to his son Louis the Stammerer, whose name sort of tells you how that went. So what's the final judgment on Charles the Bald? Scholars mostly agree he wasn't a fool, but he was overmatched. He spent his entire life trying to hold together a kingdom that wanted to disintegrate in 12 directions at once. He fought his brothers, bribed his enemies, and tried to act like an emperor in a world that no longer respected the concept. And through it all, he managed to keep France, barely, on the map. He wasn't bald, maybe, but he was definitely exposed. Exposed to betrayal, raids, and the kind of historical judgment that comes from ruling during a time when everyone else had sharper swords and fewer scruples. Next up, we revisit the ever-battered throne of Scotland, where David II manages to lose battles, get captured, twice, and somehow keep calling himself king. You'll want a sturdy chair and a strong cup of something for this one. Let's wander back into Scotland now, windy, rugged, impossible to govern Scotland, where kings didn't so much rule as hang on for dear life. Tonight's guest of honour is David II, the son of national hero Robert the Bruce, and living proof that just because your dad was a legendary freedom fighter doesn't mean you inherited his competence. David's reign is a wild ride of lost battles, long imprisonments, head-scratching diplomacy, and a royal attitude so laid back it's almost surreal. Imagine trying to lead a country while you spend half your reign locked in an English castle, and the other half pretending that nothing's on fire when everything's clearly on fire. Born in 1324, David was the only legitimate son of Robert the Bruce, who'd famously kicked English armies out of Scotland and secured its independence. Big shoes to fill, and the minute David became king, at the tender age of 5, those shoes immediately filled with water. His regency was dominated by internal squabbles, English interference, and ambitious nobles who saw the child king as a blank canvas for their own agendas. To make matters worse, Edward III of England, one of the most formidable monarchs of the period, decided it was time to drag Scotland back into England's shadow. Edward backed a rival claimant to the throne, Edward Balliol, son of the famously useless John Balliol, yes, that John from earlier. In 1332, Balliol invaded Scotland with English support, defeated the Scottish forces at Duplin Moor, and crowned himself king. David, still barely old enough to tie his own boots, was whisked away to France for safekeeping. There he grew up in exile at the French court, learning courtly manners, speaking French, and watching his kingdom burn from across the Channel. By 1341, David returned to Scotland, now 17 and eager to reclaim authority. And to his credit, he did manage to reassert control, temporarily. Balliol's puppet regime collapsed like a cheap tent, and David rode back into Edinburgh to cheers. For a moment, things looked hopeful. Scotland was scarred but still standing, and David, flush with the youthful confidence and the illusion of momentum, decided to take the fight to the English. Which brings us to Neville's Cross, 1346. In an attempt to help France, who were getting steamrolled by Edward III, David launched a campaign into northern England. It went about as well as a goose leading a cavalry charge. His army was crushed, and David himself was captured, struck in the face by 2 arrows and taken alive. It was a humiliating defeat. He was now the guest of the English, and not in the fun wine-sipping way. He would remain in English captivity for 11 years. Yes, 11. While he was gone, Scotland limped along under regents who alternated between bickering and outright rebellion. The country was broke, devastated by plague and politically paralysed. Meanwhile, David was enjoying what historians politely call a comfortable imprisonment. He was treated more like a noble guest than a traditional prisoner, given access to gardens, books, food, and even occasional outings. He lived in the Tower of London, and various English manors. He played chess. He hosted dinner parties. At one point, he allegedly considered marrying an English noblewoman. If there was a prisoner of war loyalty program, David had platinum status. Eventually, the English got tired of paying for his wine and demanded a ransom. The Treaty of Berwick in 1357 set the price at 100,000 marks, a truly staggering amount of money for medieval Scotland. David was released, and in theory he was supposed to help raise the ransom from his own kingdom. But instead he returned to Scotland with the energy of someone clocking into a job he'd already emotionally quit. Over the next 20 years, David ruled more like an absentee landlord than a monarch. He imposed heavy taxes to pay his ransom, enraging the nobles. He made increasingly bizarre diplomatic decisions, most notably offering to name Edward III of England or one of his sons as heir to the Scottish throne if he died childless. That went down like a haggis sandwich at an English banquet. The Scots, having fought tooth and nail for independence under Robert the Bruce, were not about to undo it for the sake of one man's debt problems. And here's the twist. David outlived all the chaos. He reigned until 1371, dying at age 46, which for a medieval king is practically elderly. Despite battles lost, years in captivity, and political floundering, he kept the crown on his head. No epic downfall, no dramatic final battle, just a quiet, shrugging fade into history. He left no heirs, and the throne passed to Robert II, beginning the House of Stuart. Yes, that same family that would later bring you Mary, Queen of Scots, and centuries of royal soap operas. Here's your quirky fact. During his time in England, David reportedly enjoyed gambling and once bet away several prized items of clothing, including a cloak embroidered with Scottish lions. He lost. It's hard to imagine a better symbol for his reign, literally betting the coat off his back while his kingdom sat in shambles. Historians are divided on whether David was a failure or just a victim of bad timing. Some argue he was a poor strategist, a passive ruler, and a monarch who never understood his people. Others suggest he was dealt a nearly impossible hand, becoming king as a child during a dynastic crisis, surviving plague, exile and capture, and that the mere fact he returned and reigned for decades is something of a miracle. But even his defenders have to admit, David rarely made things better, he just endured them. So let's close the gate on David Scotland, a kingdom battered by war, misrule, and English interference, ruled by a man who spent nearly as much time imprisoned as he did making actual decisions. Next up, we sail down to the sun-drenched lands of Catalonia, where Berenguer Ramon I managed to inherit everything, and somehow still let his own vassals push him around like a confused substitute teacher. Now let's steer our creaky medieval spotlight over to Catalonia in the early 11th century, a region blessed with sun, stone castles, rolling Mediterranean hills, and a noble class so independently minded they made herding cats look easy. At the centre of it all was a man named Berenguer Ramon I, the Count of Barcelona from 1018 to 1035. Berenguer wasn't technically a king, but let's not split hairs. He ruled one of the most powerful and politically rich territories in what would one day become Spain, except calling what he did ruling might be generous. If you've ever watched a substitute teacher walk into a room full of seniors 5 days before graduation, you have a general sense of Berenguer's entire political vibe. He was born around 1005, the son of Ramon Borrell, a count who had done a solid job of balancing warfare, diplomacy and development in Catalonia. Ramon Borrell had even led military expeditions against Muslim territories in Al-Andalus, bringing back loot and prestige. He was respected, feared, and the kind of count whose name was spoken with just the right amount of reverence. His son Berenguer inherited all of that, the titles, the wealth, the alliances, when he was just 13. And that's where the story starts to slice sideways. Because here's the thing, Berenguer had no interest in war, none. While his father had charged into battle and kept the nobles in line with a firm hand, Berenguer leaned hard into the idea of being a peaceful prince. He preferred religion to warfare, negotiation to swordplay, and delegation to actual leadership. Some chroniclers even praised his piety and gentleness. But in medieval Catalonia, being gentle was like showing up to a bullfight holding a salad. The local nobles, known as barons, smelled weakness almost immediately. These were rough men with small armies, private castles, and an aversion to listening to anyone but their own egos. Under Ramon Borrell, they'd been held in check. Under Berenguer, they became mini warlords, each one running their own little fiefdom like a medieval startup. Berenguer issued decrees, and the barons used them for kindling. He asked for taxes, and they responded with eye rolls and armed escorts. It didn't help that Berenguer was deeply religious and spent most of his time and energy giving land and privileges to monasteries. While that certainly got him some high marks in heaven, it did exactly nothing for controlling the growing chaos on earth. The real symbol of his struggle was the Peace and Truce of God movement. It was originally intended to reduce violence among Christian nobles by setting holy days when fighting was forbidden. Berenguer loved this. He promoted it zealously, thinking it would tame the barons. But enforcing it was another matter. The barons would nod politely, promise to behave, and then immediately start raiding each other's lands the moment Berenguer turned his back. He was trying to play chess with people who thought the board was edible. And just to twist the knife a little, Berenguer also had serious trouble managing his extended family. His younger brother Sancho was given co-rule over part of the territory, but instead of cooperating, the two ended up competing. Sancho had a stronger personality and more military flair, and several nobles openly preferred him over the actual count. Berenguer tried to smooth things over with joint charters and carefully worded treaties, but that only made him look more indecisive. Even his mother, Ermesinda of Carcassonne, wielded more effective authority during his reign. In fact, for much of his rule she acted as a de facto regent, even after Berenguer was technically an adult. Then came the Muslims. While Berenguer was busy managing his internal mess, or not managing it, more accurately, Muslim states to the south, particularly the Taifas, which were independent mini-kingdoms formed after the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate, were experiencing their own golden age of power, art and architecture. Many of these rulers were more than happy to play Catalan nobles against each other. Some Christian barons formed temporary alliances with Muslim leaders, seeking gold or strategic support. Berenguer, despite holding all the keys, had effectively lost control of foreign policy. He was the guy technically in charge of the party, but everyone was drinking the wine and moving the furniture without asking. Here's your quirky detail, Berenguer Ramon. I was so devoted to the church that he donated half his revenue to religious institutions, including some of the most lavish gifts ever seen in Catalonia up to that point. Monasteries thrived, churches were built, and the nobility, seeing their revenues drop while monks got shiny new altars, started to grumble even more loudly. The kingdom was like a bodybuilder skipping leg day. strong in the piety department but barely able to stand. Scholars are oddly conflicted about Berenguer's legacy. On one hand, he preserved Catalan borders, avoided catastrophic wars and protected the church. On the other hand, his inability to assert real political control allowed the rise of a violent, uncontrollable noble class, a trend that would dog Catalonia for generations. His reign wasn't disastrous in the flaming catapult sense. It was more like watching a fine wooden ship slowly take on water, because no one was actually plugging the leaks. When Berenguer died in 1035, just 30 years old, he left his lands to his 3 sons. 3. Dividing territory among multiple heirs was already a bad idea in theory, but in medieval Iberia, it was like wrapping your legacy in meat and tossing it into a den of wolves. Predictably, the barons exploited the division, the sons squabbled, and the central authority weakened even further. Berenguer's dream of a peaceful, religious Catalonia turned out to be less a vision than a polite request, and the medieval world had very little time for polite requests. So what's the verdict, Berenguer Ramon? I wasn't stupid and he wasn't cruel, but he mistook diplomacy for leadership and gentleness for strength. His failure wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and increasingly irreversible. Sometimes the worst kind of royal failure isn't a violent collapse. It's the slow surrender of authority until everyone forgets you were ever in charge to begin with. Now let's brush the dust off our sandals and head east, way east to the strange, short-lived kingdom of Jerusalem, where Baldwin IV tried to rule while hiding a secret that was slowly eating him alive. You've heard of him as the Leper King, but tonight we're going to look closer at what happens when your body betrays you faster than your enemies ever could. Now saddle up and follow the dusty trail into the Holy Land, where Europe's religious fever dream materialized into an actual kingdom, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At its head, for one of the most tragic and bizarre reigns in medieval history, sat a young man named Baldwin IV. You might know him by his much more cinematic title, the Leper King. Sounds dramatic, right? And it was. But behind that nickname is the story of a sharp, politically savvy ruler trapped in a decaying body trying to hold a crusader state together, while everything around him, including himself, was falling apart. The fact that he managed to hold power at all is kind of amazing. The fact that it ended badly? Well, you already knew that was coming. Baldwin IV was born in 1161 to the royal family of Jerusalem, which had been founded during the First Crusade and had spent the last several decades existing as a fragile outpost surrounded by Muslim powers who very much wanted it gone. Life in the Crusader states was a constant balancing act of diplomacy, skirmishes, marriages, and the occasional holy war. So when Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy as a child, it was more than just a medical issue. It was a full-blown crisis of legitimacy. He first showed signs of the disease around age 9. His tutor, the future Archbishop William of Tyre, noticed the boy felt no pain when he was bitten or scratched. That might sound like a minor red flag, but in a time when leprosy was believed to be a divine punishment for sin, it was the medieval equivalent of a ticking bomb strapped to the royal succession. But Baldwin's father, Amalric I, died in 1174, and at the age of just 13, Baldwin IV became King of Jerusalem. Now let's pause for a moment to appreciate what kind of nightmare Baldwin was stepping into. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was under constant threat from Muslim powers, especially the rising star of the Islamic world, Salah ad-Din, better known as Saladin. Saladin was a charismatic, disciplined, brilliant general and political tactician who was uniting Egypt and Syria under his control. Baldwin, meanwhile, was a teenage boy whose fingers were beginning to rot off. It didn't look great. But then something wild happened. Baldwin turned out to be good at this. Despite being barely old enough to rule, and despite his condition, he kept the kingdom intact through sheer force of will. He led military campaigns personally, even riding into battle on horseback while his limbs were visibly wasting away. In 1177, he scored a surprise victory against Saladin at the Battle of Montgisart, where his outnumbered forces routed the enemy in a miraculous turnaround. Chroniclers describe the teenage Baldwin riding into battle with his hands wrapped in cloth, sword raised, like something out of a fever dream. It was the medieval version of watching a terminally ill quarterback win the Super Bowl on one leg. But leprosy, as you might imagine, doesn't care about battlefield glory. Over the next few years, Baldwin's condition worsened. He lost feeling in his hands and feet. He could no longer walk without assistance. His facial features began to distort and he lost his eyesight. By his early 20s, he was completely dependent on attendants to perform basic tasks, including holding a pen or lifting a goblet. Still, he continued to rule, issuing edicts, attending councils, and doing everything he could to keep his nobles from tearing each other apart. And boy did they try. The real problem wasn't just Saladin, it was succession. Baldwin knew he wouldn't live long and needed a plan for who would rule after him. He had no children of his own, and the next closest heirs were his sister Sibylla and her young son Baldwin V. The problem? Sibylla married a man named Guy of Lusignan, and nobody liked Guy. Not the nobility, not the military orders, not even Baldwin himself. He tried to sideline Guy several times, eventually declaring that the kingdom would pass to Baldwin V, not Guy. It was a bold political move, made harder by the fact that Baldwin IV could barely speak by then. And here's your quirky detail. Baldwin once tried to abdicate but then decided not to, purely because he didn't trust anyone else to do the job properly. So he remained on the throne, physically collapsing but mentally sharper than most of the schemers around him. Imagine a man so determined not to let everything fall apart that he essentially ruled from a stretcher. It's like if FDR had insisted on leading a cavalry charge from his wheelchair with a sword. Eventually, Baldwin IV died in 1185 at the age of 24. His nephew, Baldwin V, was crowned as a child king, and within a year he too died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned. That left the throne wide open for none other than Guy of Lusignan, the man Baldwin had tried so hard to keep out of power. And within 2 years of Baldwin's death, everything he'd built imploded. Guy led the Crusader forces into one of the dumbest military disasters in Christian history, the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where he lost nearly the entire army, including the True Cross, the holiest relic in Christendom. Saladin swept through the region like a firestorm. Jerusalem fell, the Crusader kingdom, Baldwin's kingdom, collapsed. So here's the big scholarly debate. Was Baldwin IV a success or a tragic failure? Most historians land on the former. He kept a crumbling state together against impossible odds, outwitted enemies, and navigated brutal politics, all while enduring one of the most feared diseases of the age. His body failed, but his brain never did. His problem wasn't incompetence, it was that no one else around him could carry the torch once he dropped it. The failure wasn't his, it was everyone else's. Still, the visual sticks with you. A blind, disfigured king wrapped in cloth, whispering strategies while the vultures of both faith and politics circled above him. He ruled like a ghost before becoming one. And his death marked the end of Christian dominance in Jerusalem, an end that could perhaps have been delayed, if only the nobility had listened to the man dying in front of them. Next up, we hop back over to England, where a king named Ethelred the Unready proves that being unprepared isn't just a bad test-taking strategy, it's a multi-decade royal disaster that opens the door to Viking domination. Bring your horned helmets and frustration, because this one's a mess. Let's shift now to the wind-swept, rain-soaked island of Anglo-Saxon England, where governance was often less about strategy and more about frantic damage control with a strong emphasis on panic. Tonight's subject is the patron saint of doing everything wrong at the worst possible moment. Ethelred the Unready, King of England, not once but twice, and in both cases with results that make you want to rub your temples and mutter, "Why?" His nickname has become shorthand for incompetence, and for good reason, though interestingly the original meaning wasn't unprepared, but poorly advised. That's right. Ethelred Unrad was a pun. His name meant noble counsel, while Unrad meant no counsel. It's like calling a guy named Wise the Foolish charming, right? He came to the throne in 978 under tragic and suspicious circumstances. His older half-brother, Edward the Martyr, had just been assassinated at the age of 15, stabbed to death by his own attendants, possibly with Ethelred's mother pulling the strings behind the curtain. Whether Ethelred was involved or not, the stench of fratricide never really left his reign. He became king at just 10 years old, and from the beginning he was seen as tainted. The nobles didn't respect him, the church looked at him sideways, and Viking raiders probably took one whiff of the succession crisis and started sharpening their axes. And oh, the Vikings. They're the real headline in Ethelred's story. You see, for most of the previous century, England had enjoyed a relative lull in Viking attacks. But just as Ethelred took the throne, Norse raiders came roaring back like a sequel nobody asked for. Ships landed on the coast, towns were burned, monasteries were sacked. And what did Ethelred do? He panicked. He tried a little fighting, which went badly. Then he tried paying them to go away, a strategy known as Danegeld, or Danish money. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Ethelred paid out massive ransoms to Viking leaders not once, not twice, but multiple times. Each payment made the next raid more likely. Why fight for silver when you can sail up, shake your sword a little, and get a tidy payment for doing absolutely nothing? It was the medieval version of rewarding a toddler for throwing a tantrum. One especially infamous payment came in 991, after the Battle of Maldon, where an English force was defeated, and Ethelred responded by paying £10,000 of silver, a staggering sum to buy peace. The raiders took the money, sailed home, and then came back with more friends. Eventually Danegeld became a routine part of the national budget. Historians estimate that over Ethelred's reign, over £250,000 of silver were paid out to Viking invaders. It's no wonder the coinage of the time got thinner. The kingdom was bleeding money into the sea. But the real masterstroke of Ethelred's poor decision-making came in 1602, when he authorised something called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In a fit of paranoia and desperation, Ethelred ordered the mass killing of Danes living in England, including peaceful settlers and Danish women married to English men. It was a poorly planned, badly executed bloodbath that outraged Sweyn Forkbeard, the powerful king of Denmark. If Ethelred was hoping to scare the Vikings off, he failed. Sweyn responded by launching a full-scale invasion. By 1013, Sweyn had conquered most of England, and Ethelred was forced to flee to Normandy, tail between his legs. The unready king had officially lost his kingdom. Then, as if fate just enjoyed chaos, Sweyn died unexpectedly in 1014. The English nobles, unsure of what to do next, invited Ethelred back on the condition that he promised to govern more justly this time. He agreed, came back, and proceeded to mess things up all over again. Sweyn's son, Cnut the Great, wasn't about to let things lie. In 1016 he returned with a vengeance. Ethelred's forces were utterly outmatched. After a few chaotic months of co-rule and confusion, Ethelred died, leaving behind a kingdom in ruins and a legacy of missed opportunities, bad advice, and strategic faceplants. Here's your quirky detail. Despite all his failures, Ethelred had a surprisingly sophisticated legal mind. He issued numerous law codes and reform edicts, many of which were quite advanced for their time, emphasising property rights, trade regulation, and justice reform. Unfortunately, none of those mattered when Viking longships showed up on the beach with torches and battle axes. It's like publishing a lovely user manual for a sinking ship. So, was Ethelred uniquely incompetent, or just stuck in an impossible position? Scholars argue about this a lot. On the one hand, he was handed the throne as a child under a cloud of scandal, and inherited a kingdom with little centralised military power. On the other hand, he had over 3 decades to get his act together, and never really did. He made inconsistent decisions, punished loyal nobles, and relied on bribes instead of actual strategy. Even his best ideas were undermined by poor timing and worse execution. His failure wasn't just personal, it was national. By the time he died, the English throne was being passed around like a hot potato between Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and later Norman hands. The groundwork for the eventual Norman conquest of 1066 was laid right here, in the failures of Ethelred the Unready. His reign is basically the medieval case study in how not to respond to a crisis. Don't panic, don't pay off your enemies, and definitely don't commit massacres that trigger invasions. So we close the book on Ethelred, a king who faced storm clouds, then tried to hide under a very expensive umbrella made of silver coins and regret. Next up, the final stretch takes us to Italy, where Manfred of Sicily ruled like a golden prince in the shadow of legitimacy issues, papal rage, and one particularly decisive horse charge. It's the end of a dynasty, the rise of another, and a battlefield covered in roses and ruin. Let's bring this royal tragedies train to its final flaming station, with a king who had it all: charisma, ambition, golden hair that shimmered in the Sicilian sun, and still managed to lose everything in one spectacular tumble. Meet Manfred of Sicily, one of the most dazzling and doomed rulers of the late Middle Ages. His story reads like a Shakespearean play crammed into fast-forward. Bastard-born prince, brilliant general, artsy visionary, enemy of the Pope, and, ultimately, a corpse trampled under the hooves of French knights, while trying to save a kingdom he wasn't even supposed to have. You've heard of kings who made bad choices. Manfred made glorious ones. right up until they got him killed. Born around 1232, Manfred was the illegitimate son of Emperor Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, an occasional lightning rod for papal fury. Frederick was one of the most complex figures of the Middle Ages, deeply cultured, politically brilliant, constantly excommunicated, and Manfred inherited a lot of that dangerous charm. Though officially illegitimate, he was acknowledged, educated, and brought into court life. He read poetry, learned science, spoke Arabic, and knew how to handle a sword. A Renaissance prince born too early. When Frederick died in 1250, his legitimate heir Conrad IV inherited the empire. But his hold on Sicily was weak and slipping. Manfred became regent for Conrad's infant son Conradin, and from the beginning he acted like a man born to rule. With Conrad IV dead by 1254 and little Conradin stuck in Germany, Manfred stepped into the power vacuum and declared himself King of Sicily. It wasn't exactly legal, but Sicily had been so chaotic for so long that the people welcomed a strong hand, even one without all the right paperwork. And to his credit, Manfred ruled well. He rebuilt roads, supported scholars and artists, protected the Muslim communities still living in southern Italy, and created a court that was admired across Europe for its sophistication. He also crushed rebellious nobles, defeated papal forces sent to unseat him, and began styling himself as the true heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Sicily under Manfred wasn't just stable, it was beautiful. A cultural outpost of learning and elegance in an otherwise violent, fractured Italy. There was just one problem: the Pope hated his guts. Pope Urban IV, followed by Clement IV, viewed Manfred as an illegitimate usurper, an obstacle to papal authority, and a symbol of everything the Church feared in imperial overreach. The papacy had long been at war, literally and spiritually, with the Holy Roman Emperors. Manfred, being a chip off that imperial bloc, became target number one. The Pope excommunicated him several times for good measure, declared his rule null, and invited foreign princes to come depose him in the name of God. Enter Charles of Anjou, brother of the King of France, and a man with ambition so thick you could pour it over pasta. Backed by papal funds, holy authority, and a French army, Charles sailed to Italy to liberate the kingdom. What followed was the classic medieval smackdown between a popular embattled native ruler and an elite outsider with papal backing and steel-tipped reinforcements. Manfred tried to rally support. He even offered terms, tried diplomacy, and hoped to stall Charles long enough for help to arrive from Germany or the Hohenstaufen loyalists in the north. But nothing came. The tide was turning. In 1266, the armies met near Benevento, and everything came crashing down. Manfred's army was a mix of German mercenaries, Saracen archers, and Sicilian nobles, fierce but divided. Charles's French knights were better equipped, disciplined, and backed by a war chest from Rome. The battle was brutal and close, but when Manfred's German forces broke ranks, it turned into a rout. Manfred, ever the tragic romantic, dressed in his finest armour, crowned himself with a golden circlet, and charged into battle. He was struck down, not even recognised at first. His body was found under a heap of dead men, stripped and buried without ceremony. He was just 30. Charles of Anjou took Sicily, and the Angevin dynasty began. But the story doesn't end there, because the Sicilians, as it turned out, did not like being ruled by the French. Less than 20 years later, in 1282, they exploded in rebellion during the infamous Sicilian Vespers, where thousands of French were slaughtered in a single night. Manfred, dead and buried, was vindicated. His people had loved him after all. Here's your quirky detail. The Pope was so enraged by Manfred's legacy that he ordered his body exhumed, declaring that someone excommunicated couldn't be buried in holy ground. Manfred's remains were dug up, carted off, and tossed near the banks of the Garigliano River, exiled in death as he had been in life. That's how deep the grudge ran. Medieval church politics had no chill. Scholars have long debated whether Manfred was a usurper or a visionary, a tyrant or a tragic hero. What's clear is that he was more capable than most legitimate monarchs of his era. He governed wisely, defended his kingdom valiantly, and died trying to hold off a machine far larger than himself. His failure wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to too much competence in the wrong bloodline. The Pope couldn't afford another strong Hohenstaufen, so Manfred had to go. And with that, we bring our grand parade of medieval royal misfires to a close. From crowned infants to glass-boned kings, from the battlefield to the bathtub, you've seen it all. Betrayal, collapse, delusion, and just plain bad luck. Some were fools, some were tragic, most were both. History remembers their names, not because they succeeded, but because they failed magnificently. Now, gently lower your crown, dim the torchlight, and settle into silence. The story winds down here, and all that remains is the soft echo of hoofbeats and hollow thrones. So after 30 sections, what have we learned from this royal gallery of medieval mishaps? Maybe it's that power, for all its grandeur and gold, doesn't guarantee wisdom. Maybe it's that thrones attract not just the bold, but also the baffled, the brittle, and the breathtakingly unlucky. And maybe it's just that humans, no matter how many titles they slap in front of their name, remain gloriously flawed creatures, prone to bad decisions, fragile egos, and a deep tendency to mess things up on an epic scale. But there's something comforting in that too, isn't there? These kings, with their crowns and castles, were just people. People who got overwhelmed, or confused, or trapped in roles they didn't choose. Sometimes they meant well, sometimes they didn't. Either way, they stumbled their way through history just like the rest of us, only with way fancier robes. So if your day's been chaotic, or you've made a mistake or two lately, take heart. At least you didn't start a 100-year war, lose an empire to your in-laws, or drown in a river because you wore too much armour. And if you did, well, congratulations! You're in royal company! Thanks for joining me on this marathon of misrule. Sleep easy, dream of castles, and remember, sometimes the best kings are the ones who never made it to the throne.